Washington. This is Amanda Fargiano, Chair of the School Committee, and this is a school committee working session focused on reopening. We have just one topic tonight, today. It feels like tonight. And before we get into it, I'd like to invite everyone to stand and say the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, first of all, thank you for making time on Sunday. I know we all really appreciate it. We all need this time to talk about this topic. I also want to thank everybody for the careful attention to open meeting law. I mean, there's so much that I know we want to talk about, and you guys have been awesome about not having any deliberation outside of meetings. So it's hard, and we've done a great job, and I really appreciate it. So thank you to you. And I know a lot of people are watching, so Dr. Kavanaugh, if you would just put the first slide. I want to take a couple of minutes and talk about process. So first of all, what is our job regarding reopening? Our job is to determine the best learning model, which is educational policy, for our students for the remainder of the fiscal year 21 school year. This is what we're talking about today. I pulled out two pieces of policy that I think are helpful. The school committee must decide, weighing all the factors, how to deliver on our operational goals as defined by our policy BA. And there's an excerpt. The school committee's primary responsibility is to establish those purposes, programs, and procedures that will best produce the educational achievement needed by our students. The committee is charged with accomplishing this while also being responsible for wise management of resources available to the school system. The other piece I pulled out of policy BCA, which is about school committee ethics, I believe, is that school committee must realize that their primary responsibility is to the children. And these policies are available on the district website. These are excerpts from longer documents, but I think the essence of what I've pulled out is true, that our focus is on educating children. So what I propose to you guys, and let's talk about process, is that we maybe first start with agreeing on some basic principles, getting some agreement in the sort of grounding principles, because then we'll look at each of the models, K to 5, 6 to 8, and 9 to 12. And if we have sort of an agreement of basic principles and we get stuck in the weeds, we can refer back and we will have kind of establish some ground rules. So does anyone have any alternate procedure or way to go about this that they'd like to recommend?
No, I think you did a great job setting things in order.
All right, you're at my mercy then. Okay, next slide, please, Dr. Kavanaugh. So first principles, and we're not voting anything today, just so the public knows too, we are not taking any votes. This is purely a working session, a chance for us to deliberate on all of the information that has come in. So what I was hoping was these 6 things we can just establish, do we agree or not on these things? The first item, I think we've heard from all of our teachers, we've heard from pretty much everybody that all things being equal, in-person learning is the best model for academic growth, social emotional well-being, and mental health of our students. Does anybody think that that's not true, or do we all agree? The second point, a child's ability to learn depends in part on their overall physical and emotional well-being. And I think we've talked a lot about that in the recent years in our investment in mental health in general, way before the pandemic. So I don't think we would disagree with that, but if anyone disagrees, I'll wait. Okay. Number 3, COVID conditions and our understanding of the pandemic mandated a shift from full in-person learning. That happened way back first in March and then has adjusted this year as well. If those conditions either no longer hold true or can be successfully mitigated, then we must at least consider a return to in-person learning. Joe.
I agree generally with that, except I'm not sure that COVID conditions in our understanding of the pandemic mandated the shift that we chose. As you'll recall, we chose a distance metric of 6 feet. That was our choice. The state had given us a chance to choose 3. So I agree with all of it. It's just the word mandated. I'm not sure if that's quite accurate.
Okay, fair enough. I think that maybe guided our shift. I mean, I don't know, we don't have to wordsmith, but I think it was sort of our understanding at the time, maybe.
Yeah, something other than mandated. We based on, we chose, I think is more accurate.
Okay.
Based on and then how you open your sentence, and then instead of mandated, we chose, you know.
Does everybody agree with the second part, that if we have any feeling that the conditions don't hold true any longer, that we really need to at least consider reopening?
I sort of disagree with the change from mandated. We had to go and shift from in-person learning. The 6 feet is a different story, but we had to. We had to not do in-person learning. Whether we went to a hybrid with 3 feet or 4 feet, we had to go away from full in-person learning. It was required at that time.
In March.
Yeah.
March,
Well, and
April.
transportation has shifted since then, and that was a major barrier in September for our ability to open, the
Yeah.
restrictions on numbers of children on the buses.
So I think
I
the 4
believe-
feet to 6 feet is different.
Yeah, so I guess it's good, if you don't mind, through the chair, this might be a good discussion point to clarify and maybe become better informed myself. My understanding was that because of 6 feet, we couldn't fit all the children in the school on the same day. So we divided into 2 cohorts so that we could maintain 6 feet. And I guess where I'm jumping from there, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that had we kept 3 feet, we may have been able to keep all the children in the school each of the 5 days per week. So we chose, as you recall, we chose 6 feet, even though the state gave us the option of 3 feet.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
may I?
Yeah, please.
So, yes, back in March, you know that we were mandated to close our schools. But
Yep.
when September came, we had to develop a plan. And we did choose 6 feet. But even if we had chosen 3 feet, we would have had difficulty with transportation and with lunch. So those 2 things would have been barriers at that time.
That's very helpful. In that case, Leah, would you be okay with the word changing to reflect what the superintendent just said, that COVID conditions, operational constraints, and our related decisions at that time?
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Do we want to preface it with a time frame in March?
Yep, I can do that. And this is really to guide our work today. I mean, we're not like publishing this, but I will edit it.
We're not voting on it.
We're not voting on it.
Understood.
I will edit it, though, because I think it's useful, and I'll edit it after the meeting, to just have it to rely on, because we have a vote on the horizon, and as we all are going through so much information that sometimes when we lose our way in our sort of first principles, it's nice to have wording that we've agreed to in spirit to fall back on. So I will edit it, 'cause I think
Thank
this
you,
is
yeah.
important.
And again, it's in that spirit that I offer it. So I know when you're talking first principle, I think of the foundation stones of a building.
Yeah.
They need to be set just right. So I understand it's guiding, and the accuracy therefore is the context. Thank you.
Yes, and if I may,
in
one more
that-
time, as we think about those operational obstacles for lunch and transportation, they were very real, but we did choose 6 feet when we wrote our report last summer.
I think in that spirit, then, I want to go back to number 1.
Okay.
Because I think it's the best model for academic learning for most of our students. I think, we have anxiety issues. We have very real problems with children who are dealing with this COVID crisis in different ways. And for them, the remote model may be actually a better choice.
Yeah.
And in fact, I'm seeing that with my younger son, who's getting amazing grades doing remote because he doesn't have to deal with the anxiety of being in front of the teacher right now. So I think just most of our students, I want to make sure that, we keep in mind that there are students who may actually be doing well.
I also want to add on, to piggyback onto that, that I think for some kids, the hybrid model probably is better for their social and emotional well-being. That and we've heard that from families, that have heard in the community about children for whom hybrid has worked very well, even though we know that there are lots that it has not worked for. There are some who are anxious about full return and about being closer to kids and anxious about choices that have to be made from there.
Yeah, to clarify, when I put number 1 down, I should have prefaced it with all other things being equal in an ideal setting. Ideally, I mean, not COVID times, not, I think ideally, we have built our education system on the idea that kids come into school with, so that was what I was trying to get at. Like, if all the other things weren't there, ideally, do we think that's the best way?
Can you add at the beginning, under ideal circumstances?
I absolutely can.
Thank you.
Because I totally agree that in COVID times, children have adjusted and found sort of their own optimal under COVID conditions, and that is not always in person. I think you're right, Leah. So under ideal conditions. Okay. This is good. So number 4 is, again, coming off of all of the material that we've read in the reopening report, all the studies that were quoted, do we agree that in a classroom setting, masked students and staff spaced 4 feet or more apart mitigate risk, as well as students and staff who are masked 6 feet apart? So this is a real foundational question for us, because this is coming out of the study from the Reopening Advisory Committee. What we heard was essentially, if you're masked and you're sitting in a desk, whether you're 4 feet or 6 feet, you're out of the realm of droplets. We have HVAC turnover. It's equally safe. Do we agree with that?
So this one was hard for me until Friday. I have to admit, we've gotten a lot of feedback from parents who actually are in the medical field, who have gone back and forth. I mean, I've heard so many different versions of this. But Friday, when I watched the amendment presentation and he brought up that study where he compared all the different school districts that had gone for 3 feet and 6 feet and showed the differences in infection levels, I was like, okay, I can't argue this anymore. There's too much data. So I think I'm okay agreeing to 4 now after seeing that study, because the data was super clear. There were a little bit of differences, but they mostly followed the same path. And I can't remember how many school districts he mentioned that it was in the peer-reviewed study, but it was significant amount.
It was. Do you remember?
Yeah, I have the,
I don't.
through the chair, if you wouldn't mind, it might be of public benefit to read an excerpt of that piece of the
If you have it,
board meeting.
great.
I have a transcript. So
Do you have it?
in the meeting yesterday, Secretary Riley said that the medical community has been clear. Signed letter from over 300 physicians indicates the medical community believes that students need to come back to school. Very explicit and clear to come back at 3 feet of distance, set at the beginning of the summer. That guidance, Secretary Riley said, was built with the medical community over the summer, based on the Lancet report that showed negligible difference between 1 meter and 2 meter of spacing. In Lancet is a world medical journal. Schools around the world were the foundation of that study. Other states have been using 3 feet, including states in New England. Nonetheless, a new study is coming out that is going to show the difference between schools in Massachusetts at 3 feet and schools in Massachusetts at 6 feet, including both staff cases and student cases. Evidence from statewide data directly compares the number of COVID cases with in-person learning at 6 feet versus in-person learning at 3 feet. Massachusetts does have many schools currently at 3 feet. Multidisciplinary study team of doctors and scientists managed to review the infection control plans. 194 districts at 6 feet and 49 with a minimum of 3 feet social distance across 243 districts in Massachusetts. From September 30th through January 27th, it included 6 million student learning weeks and 1 million staff learning weeks. During the entire study period, 4,430 students and 2,584 cases in school staff. And they did not find a higher rate of cases of COVID-19 in either students or staff in districts with students who were spaced more closely. The number of cases in the community was a far better predictor than spacing between people in the building. Researchers found that for students and staff, the case rate per 100,000 was lower for both students and staff in the schools than in the community. By decreasing the space from 6 feet to 3 feet, schools can continue to be safe and not cause increasing rates of COVID-19. The study is called The Effectiveness of 3 Feet versus 6 Feet of Physical Distancing for Controlling Spread of COVID-19 Among Students and Staff, a retrospective statewide cohort study. It has undergone peer review by members of Editorial Board of Clinical Infectious Disease and by specialists in this field, and provisionally was accepted for publication in a major infectious disease journal. Sorry for the length of that, but I found that I have always struggled with debating medical advice as a volunteer school board member. And I thought, like Leah, that kind of was definitive enough for me. And certainly there are different opinions and outliers, but that is the consensus opinion.
Thank you for sharing that. And I, as a sort of a visual person at times, and if anyone does go back and watch the Board of Ed hearing, they presented a chart which shows, you could show the curve of the staff and the student, either 6 feet or 3 feet. The curve of the lines, they were mirroring each other directly, whether it was 6 feet or 3 feet. The shape was the same, the trajectory and the count. So I agree, it was very compelling evidence. Meg or Nancy, do you have any comments on number 4?
Well, I just wanted to add that I would encourage the audience to go and watch that meeting, because I hope today we can discuss aspects that refer immediately to our district based on the fact that we've all seen that meeting.
Yeah.
And I thank Joe for repeating that information, but I worry we're going to get bogged down in repeating that information again.
Yeah. Just, Dr. Kavanagh, do you happen to know how people can find that meeting? I think I Googled Massachusetts Board of Education hearings or something.
I posted it on my Facebook for people who have Facebook, on my school district, school committee Facebook page. I found the exact link and I copied it over.
So why don't maybe I'll ask our administrator, Georgette, if she can post the link to that hearing along with the reopening materials on your website.
Surely.
That would be
Yes,
helpful.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Through the chair.
Yes.
The only thing I have, based on what I just read, is in bullet 4 there, you say 4 feet. And I gather that's because we say 4 feet in the opening plan. But I would prefer if we talk about 3 feet, because that's what's talked about in the literature.
Okay.
In fact, I don't have any scientific evidence comparing 6 feet to 4 feet. I have it comparing 6 feet to 3 feet. So presumably it would be the same, but
Yeah.
4 feet is a bit of an arbitrary number that we came up with here.
Yes, if I may, the way we came up with 4 feet was simply to take a standard classroom, put desks in there, and spread them out as far as we could. And when we spread them out as far as we could, we realized, oh, the kids would be 4 feet apart, nose to nose. And so that's really why we chose that number. I mean, we can certainly put the desks closer together, which is what they would traditionally be, and traditionally desks would be about 3 feet apart. So we're just giving it a little bit of extra space.
Okay.
So
That's great.
just to follow on that, I think if we're saying the first principles, oddly enough, I agree with Joe. As a first principle, 3 feet
Yeah.
is true. I agree with having 4 feet because in my head, I'm picturing a student pushing back from their desk and getting closer to another desk when they pull their chairs out or when they move. And so having the 1 foot room
Yeah.
seems fair to me. But I think as a scientific principle, it says 3 feet in the science.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I will change that. I think you're absolutely right. And I agree with you, Leah, too. You know, you're leaning over to your bag and, you know, that
Yes.
little extra room gives comfort, but it is a 3-foot study, so.
And if we were to go with 3 feet, it really does give us a lot more leeway, I think, in our classrooms.
Okay. Number 5 is, again, I think based on our own experience and other information that we've heard, in an unmasked setting, a minimum of 6 feet of social distance is required for effective risk mitigation. there wasn't a lot of talk about unmasked at the Bessie hearing, and a lot of this is what comes down to like lunch and mask breaks and so forth. But I think when people talk about the CDC guidance, that still says 6 feet. They don't clarify, but I mean, 6 feet, if you're unmasked, if you're at like a restaurant, or is typically, I think, where the 6 feet comes in. So I feel comfortable with 6 feet in an unmasked situation. Is that where we all are? Are we all in the same agreement? Okay, that's what we've had for lunch in our
Right, and lunch
in
has
schools
had
to
no-
date. We haven't seen
Yes.
spread at lunch, so.
Yeah.
And the last thing I put out there is sort of more of a part of our fiduciary responsibility. Structured learning time, this is a number that comes down from DESE. Structured learning time is an important metric that measures sort of a minimum service level that we must provide our students. It's mandated by the state. We saw adjustments to that came through in January, and we had to adjust. We didn't really have a choice. So if there are conversations around you have to meet structured learning time, and if DESE no longer honors remote instruction as structured learning time, we have to find a way to meet our state mandates for things like, specifically for structured learning time. Does anybody disagree? And are there any other sort of really foundational principles that, I didn't want to get into evaluating the models. That's what we're going to take these principles and do next, but I wanted to get to some just basic understanding. Joe?
You know, one thing I've heard from our town health director and other health professionals is, and I don't know if this qualifies as first principle, but it seems to be in the same context as 4 and 5, is that health controls such as attestation, restrictions on presence of individuals who have COVID-like symptoms, whether they think it's COVID or not. If they have COVID-like symptoms, we wouldn't send our children to school. So restrictions and controls on making sure people with COVID-like symptoms aren't in the school, as well as the, we have people who count who sat near one another, the close contact. Contact tracing. So I think attestation, restriction of individuals with COVID-like symptoms, and contact tracing have been effective measures for controlling spread in the school. I'd like to see.
I could add that.
Okay,
If
others
everyone
agree.
agrees, I can definitely add that. I think
Sounds
you're
good.
right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay.
I like that. Anything else before we dive in? Meg? No? Okay. It's hard to tell with the masks, so. Okay, so I don't really have any slides for the models, but I thought we would just take one sort of age group at a time. So K to 5, actually, Dr. Kavanaugh, you have a slide that summarizes
I
K
do,
to 5.
yes.
Would you mind pulling that up?
That would be fine.
Dr. Kavanaugh has a whole lot of information, so if we have pieces of information that we are looking to bring forward, there are lots of slides that she has at the ready for us. So what we're talking about at K to 5 was all 3 buildings would attend full-time, keep their regular full school day. The elementary schedules would remain intact. The cohort combinations will not require a change in teacher. Lunch will be served in the cafeterias and gymnasiums, which would then move the PE classes outdoors or into the classroom for a wellness lesson. There were some costs associated with this, with buying desks to outfit lunch and so forth. But where are you guys with the K to 5? So this K to 5 is what we heard at the Bessie hearing. So what we heard on Friday, and maybe Dr. Kavanaugh, you can summarize what we heard on Friday from Bessie that is our new voted instruction about K to 5.
Sure, so the commissioner now has regulatory authority to require all K to 5 students to return to the classroom by April 5th.
Okay, through the chair to the superintendent. The desks, I've heard a lot of parents asking about the desks, and I know that we have a good answer for that, correct? It had to do with the Elmwood furniture. Is that correct, Dr. Kavanaugh?
Yes, I actually do have a slide for you on that. let's see. All right, I do know that families are very concerned. How come I didn't catch up there? Maybe it will. Here we go. A little slow from here to there. I know families are very concerned about costs to reopen. So I did put something together so that people could see what those costs look like. And I put them together under 3 categories: furniture, supervision, and transportation. How are we going to pay for them, and what are we going to do with the money? So if you take a look, Marathon required 167 desks. We were looking at paying for that out of Coronavirus Relief Fund money. The dollar amount is $26,457. Elmwood and Hopkins both need 130 desks. That would be coming out of capital. And together, you're looking at about $57,000. And when you're wondering about capital, we have money there because of the modular classrooms. So when you put the modular classrooms on, you would also be considering how to purchase furniture for your modular classrooms. So that's where that's coming from. Lunch monitors taken from Coronavirus Relief Fund money, and that's about $60,000 for Marathon, Elmwood, Hopkins, and the middle school. We're not thinking about lunch monitors for the high school, obviously. And an additional bus run so that we can bus students from the high school at midday is $76,500. If we break those into 2 categories, you've got about $57,000 in capital, $163,000 in ESSER 2 money, which comes to $220,292. And if you, I have another slide that will show that when we're talking also about looking at some kind of COVID-19 surveillance pool testing for students, we were also thinking about using that ESSER 2 money for that. So now we have competing interests on that money. Will there be additional Coronavirus Relief Fund money coming into Hopkinton? We believe that the answer is yes.
But I think my question was more, parents are worried about like buying all these desks and then what are we going to do with them once this is over? So I know that you had given us an answer to that, and so I was hoping you could elaborate on, okay, once, we don't need these 6 feet anymore, what are we doing with all these desks we're buying?
Sure, and I know as parents look at those dollar amounts, they think that's an awful lot of money. But without those desks, if we still have 6 feet of distancing at lunch in the fall, and I can't imagine that we won't need that in September. I don't have a crystal ball, maybe we won't. But my guess is if the plan is to fully reopen in September, we're still going to need all of those desks. What we did was we actually cut back on a lot of the money. We were originally thinking it was going to cost us about $100,000 in desks. We have found sort of these laptop kinds of trays, and Mrs. Rothermick refers to them as the TV trays. I think you have to be a certain age to know what a TV tray is, but they do market them as laptop tables, and they are, you just buy them through Walmart, and they're about $28 a piece. So those are what we'll be putting also in our cafeterias to kind of compensate for this. And I didn't put it onto the slide because the amount of money is really quite low for that, but it's a nice way, I think, to compensate. One of the things Mrs. Bolello has already started to do at Hopkins is to take music stands. And if you take the music stand that would normally hold up paper like this and you tilt it to the side and then just tighten the wing nuts on those, you can actually put student lunch trays on them, which was just like another moment of genius. They are a little rickety, so I wouldn't recommend them for Marathon kids or for Elmwood kids because there might be a lot of lunches on the floor. But that's another way, I think, to kind of get around this. Last thing I'll say about desks is if you've seen the desks at the Elmwood School, you know that they were probably purchased in the late 70s. They are in dismal, dismal shape. So in the event that we have newer desks that we could move into Elmwood, that would not be disastrous. And in the event that we get invited into MSBA, it might be nice to have some of those desks already, so that would be another cost that we're incurring. So.
Can I ask just a point of clarification? This number here is for the tabletop, the TV tray things, or is it for regular desks?
Those are for regular desks.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if we were able to switch some of those out to these TV-type laptop trays, it would go down?
I think we're looking at this and those
this
TV
and,
trays.
gotcha.
Yes. We had a bunch of them on the middle school too, but then we realized that if we pulled all of the old science tables out of storage, we could start putting science tables in the cafeteria and probably be able to put kids at those as well. So we're looking at anything we can do to eliminate the TV trays, if you will.
So are these desks listed here only for lunchtime, to be placed in the auditorium?
No, because right now, you know that the Marathon School is not a school that uses desks.
Yes.
When it was built as an early learning center, so we had wonderful little tables in those, and that's the kind of education that we do now at the elementary level, with kidney tables for reading and, you know, all different stations throughout the room for different activities. But if you have to move to desks, then you are going to have the desks that we have in there now that we've stolen from Elmwood and additional desks. So if, for example, you went into this high school and we looked at a classroom here today, you might see 14 desks in a classroom. That classroom is going to need to take desks like the ones you see in this room and lug them back into that classroom to get us up to 26, say, for example. So what we're going to need teachers to do is put signs outside their rooms, how many desks do you need, so that the custodians can start reloading the classrooms as well as loading the cafeterias.
So now I understand that more clearly. So these will be for classrooms and the cafeteria for eating lunch in
Yes.
all of these different schools.
And I would say mostly for classrooms.
Mostly for classrooms.
Some-
Because isn't it for younger learners the best pedagogical model to have those kidney-shaped tables, or tables in which kids are closer together looking at each other?
For guided reading, absolutely. For those kinds of situations where you want to pull kids in small group,
Right.
that's exactly what you'd want to have. Mrs. Bilella will talk about how nice it is right now to have 12 desks in a classroom. So if they move, you could have 4 or 5 kids all sitting on the floor in the middle of the room working on science. Once you return the desks, you won't be able to do some of those pedagogical models.
That's right. So we're taking away some of our pedagogical models in order to provide this 3 feet of distance, which are we entirely sure about the need for that with elementary students?
Yeah, that's the discussion right now, right?
So if we believe in the 3 feet of social distance, you know, you can still put kids, 3 or 4 of them, in some kind of a semicircle with a teacher, but they'll never be shoulder to shoulder like they would have been at a kidney table. So we can somewhat replicate it, but not entirely replicate it, if that's making sense.
And so eventually, perhaps even as soon as next fall, we may not need all of these individualized desks because we'll be returning to the kidney-shaped tables.
Right, so say if you're looking at 67 desks at Marathon, you know, those nice new desks are desks that could go into Elmwood to replace the ones that are, I mean, if you see the desks at Elmwood, they're pretty deplorable. We're still using them, of course, but they're in terrible shape. And I know that's an awful lot of money. When you look at $26,000 for desks, that's an awful lot of money coming out of Coronavirus Relief Fund. It truly is.
Do you know what the difference in price between an actual desk and the laptop tables are?
Oh, the desks are running somewhere around $200 for the desk and the chair, and the laptop tables are about $28, $30 a piece.
Do we need a chair too, or do they have chairs? Do we have enough chairs?
What we're thinking for, like the middle school, for example, is that we will take the folding chairs that belong to the high school. You know, like when we have something like graduation and you see 9 million chairs out there, and we'll put them in with their science tables so that we wouldn't have to buy them for, and so there are places where there's a surplus of chairs, so we'll kind of be able to move them in. And we may have first graders sitting on chairs that, you know, could be as tall as those high school ones right there. So they'll need a little boost up, but they'll get there. It won't be ideal, but we'll have enough tables and chairs.
So, follow up on the tables, the music trays. Interestingly, my 5th grader came home and told me that this is what was going to happen, which was hard for me to visualize, but knowing now that they can be secured into position, I can understand it better than the way my daughter was telling it. Are we concerned, though, about damage to the music trays and needing to replace them when we're able to get our music program fully in person? And
No, I don't think we are.
Okay.
You know, if you just tip it to its side and
Yeah.
tighten the wing nuts, I don't know that kids would be able to really damage them. And the ones that are at Elmwood and Hopkins, the music stands that are there, they are hand-me-downs from the high school, so they're not in great shape to start with, but I think that they'll be okay. We practiced with them at Elmwood and at Hopkins.
Can I just ask about the
Yeah.
capital money? So if we repurpose some of the capital money for furniture that we need for COVID reopening, will we, how will we be able to outfit the classroom, the modulars, for the way it was originally intended to spend this capital money? Will we be covered there?
We
or-
planned to buy desks, we're just buying more of them.
Okay,
You know,
so
when
we
you
had
build the
extra
4
capital
modular
budget.
classrooms, yeah, we might have thought about buying only 20 for each, so there'd be like an additional 50 that are coming out of capital money for Elmwood and for Hopkins.
And we have that money in our capital budget now, is that?
We do in the modular budgets, yes.
Great.
Okay, could
A
you go
lot
back?
of thinking has been going into how to make that happen.
Yes.
Sounds like it.
So, as I understood it coming out of the public forum on the 4th, it sounded to me, and I don't know, but it sounded to me like the class sizes, when we bring the orange and green together, would reflect our sort of typical class sizes that we have. It sounded like they were all going to be no more than 24, I think was the highest at Hopkins.
Elmwood.
Oh,
Yeah, I think Mrs.
Elmwood, you're
Colella
right, it
said
was-
19 to 22 in all of hers, but Mrs. Carver, I think, does have a second grade and a third grade classroom that will hit 24.
Which
And-
happens some years, though, correct? I mean, I feel like I remember I have had kids in bigger classes than that in non-COVID times.
Oh, yes, and I think when we had kids at center school, we had some very large K-1 classes because physically there was not another classroom to put them in. I mean, 24 is not ideal, but it's also not unusual. And you know there are some districts that that's the norm. It's not in Hopkinton, but it is in other places.
So my questions about K through 5, and I didn't have K through 5. I had a child in middle school, I had a child in high school, but I came after the K through 5 point, so I don't know exactly how this works. But I know that I worry in the high school in terms of hallways, and I worry in the high school in terms of bathrooms, and I worry about all the places that are more unstructured where kids may bump into each other, etc. In the elementary school, I assume it's a little more structured, like when the break happens, where the kids are taken, the teacher leads. I mean, that was my experience with elementary school with my children elsewhere. So I assume that there's a lot more structure in the hallways. Is that correct from K through 5?
Oh, it's absolutely correct. If you spent 5 minutes at the Elmwood School, you'd see teachers, they walk out of the classroom, they've got their kids organized in lovely lines, and they leave the classroom and they head to the gym, for example. But the kids are great at walking in the hallways, they know how to do it. It's kind of interesting, I think, in the first couple of weeks of school in any elementary school, that's what we do, right? We build routines almost before we get super hung up on the learning. I mean, naturally, learning starts from day one, but routine building in the beginning is critical.
I have another question. When will we know for certain how many students will return full-time and how many will remain remote? Because won't that help us better determine how many desks we might need and what kind of spacing arrangements we can make? Because now it's pretty hypothetical, isn't it? We don't know what families want to do if they only have these two choices.
Yes, the numbers that we're working with are built really on the assumption that the hybrid students would come 5 days a week and the remote students would remain remote. What we've sort of seen happen when other districts have done their polling is there's very, very little movement between those two, just because families, I think, have become quite accustomed to teachers and programs and lifestyles and all of those kinds of things. But I will say that the earlier we get our surveys out, the better off we'll be. The building principals would love to be able to send a survey tomorrow morning and just say, it's a binding survey in the event that we make this change, because that's going to help them to understand, in the event that I have to take 40 kids who are currently hybrid and make them remote, and 15 kids who are currently remote and make them hybrid, how long would that take to actually have that scheduling done and then have it done through Power School as well, because you could make it on paper, but then it has to be done sort of mechanically as well.
So when do you think we'll have that information? If they do send a survey tomorrow, which I hope they will, when will we have that information?
They would like to send that survey tomorrow if it's all right with you, but I just don't want people thinking this is a done deal if we send the survey tomorrow. We're really doing it for informational purposes.
Yes.
But, you know, usually we like to keep a survey like that open. I mean, this one's going to be kind of a rush, so I would say it might be like 48, 72 hours. In an ideal world, we could open it tomorrow and you would have information on Thursday evening.
Okay.
That would be
If
helpful.
You're agreeable to that.
I think that
Really
would be
helpful.
When the-
Thank you.
I think also because when the last survey went out, the details of this particular proposal had not, number one, that had not gone forward, and number two, it was not clear that the state was going to mandate K-5 to go open fully, that in fact, our ability to make this happen or not is kind of dictated by the state, assuming that we would not qualify for waivers based on what the state puts out.
Yes, that's correct. And I know people, when they got previous surveys, they were heightened. But, you know, all of those were non-binding surveys. I think we were very clear that they were not binding surveys. They were really just information gleaning surveys.
So this you would send to remote, every family would get the survey about.
Every family would get the survey. Yes, if you come 5 days, we would say, would you still like to come 5 days, or would you prefer to go remote? If you're hybrid, do you want to come 5 days? Or go remote? If you're remote, would you like to stay remote or go hybrid? And just see where people are with that.
Okay, I was gonna ask about that, because I think on the meeting on Friday, there was mention that, you know, part of the hope was that any student who was remote who wanted to come full-time would be able to, was what I heard from Desi, right?
Yes, I think I heard that as well.
So I just wanted, so that was gonna be part of my question.
And I do want to be clear with remote families that, you know, we will absorb as many remote students as we can, but at some point, we may need to dismantle a remote classroom. So, for example, right now, if we have 4 remote classrooms with 25 students in each at Hopkins, and 20 kids who are in 4th grade decide that they all want to come back in, we may have to take one of those classrooms and make that teacher an in-person teacher. And take the 5 kids who don't want to, sprinkle them across, and, you know, so it might get a little bit tricky. I truly do not believe that we're going to have that kind of decision-making on the parts of families. But we really won't know that until the survey goes out, so the survey is important.
I think it's also good that you're surveying the 5-day-a-week kids, because some of those
Yes.
families may feel that the changed conditions, they would be not comfortable with.
Yes, yes.
On the K-5 topic, I did want to share, I think it was Wednesday, we had the school committee roundtable where Nancy and I had to leave the municipal leader meeting to go, because we had pre-scheduled the session with the 10 or so other school committee chairs. And one of the things that came up about educational learning for elementary kids, one of the districts had been able to bring in their young learners, and they had done some benchmark testing when they started, and then at about 2 months later, they tested again. And very much in line with what Mrs. Carver said at our Thursday meeting is exactly what we heard on Wednesday, was that they found tremendous recovery of learning loss in like a short amount of time, just being back in school for the elementary kids. They were really surprised and pleased, but surprised at how much learning had been recovered and gained in a very short amount of time. So I know a lot of people are concerned about, well, gee, the year's almost over, and, you know, maybe we don't need to do this. But it was interesting to hear from a neighboring district that has actually been walking down this journey already and actually measuring their own kids and getting results that indicated that this is, you know, it's worth it for these K-5ers, you know, sort of taking it one chunk of grades at a time. For the K-5ers, it's really worth it to give them back whatever we can with the couple months we have left. So I just wanted to share that because it was an anecdote. I think I've represented what was said,
Yes,
right?
absolutely. And also now you reminded me that Mrs. Carver did say they had invited some children back in to come 5 days who weren't on IEPs but were struggling under the current model, and that my recollection is she had said they found similarly in those children that they had recovered some of what was lost.
Yes.
Yeah. So I just wanted to share that.
One quick question with that, and I'm sorry, I came up with it this morning, and I was like, it's too late to ask this, Dr. Kavanaugh to bring data on this, but I don't have a feel for how much learning loss has happened this year. Like, I don't, like, we're talking about regaining learning and regaining, catching up and meeting objectives for the year, but I don't have a feel for how far we're behind or whether our kids are doing fairly well, or like I realize that I'm missing that, and it just occurred to me this morning, so I hugely apologize that I couldn't send anything ahead of time. But do we have any sort of information on that?
We do have lots of data. We've been doing the STAR reading, STAR math, BAS, QRI, so we have been testing our kids. If I asked maybe Mrs. Carver and Mrs. Bolello to kind of take a look at where we are this year as opposed to where we would have been in previous years, and we just took the maybe averages of those scores, what I've heard anecdotally, and so I don't have data to show you on this, but what I've heard anecdotally is that even though our kids were out of school last year in March, and then they've been back half-time really, since September, our kids are, and I shouldn't say half-time, because on the asynchronous days, there's certainly, ample engagement for them in things that would advance the learning. But they would say that they think that we're about 3 months behind where we would normally be. Which I guess after a year's time in a global pandemic, we should feel pretty good, I think, about where our kids are. I'm still very pleased about the fact that we have our kids coming in every other day.
Yes.
Because if you go a week on and then 10 days off, the learning loss, there are metrics that will show you that learning loss is pretty intense. But I think that the every other day contact really kind of, jars kids' memories and helps them to retain, so.
But that really, really helps.
I believe it did.
Thank you.
Okay, so what else do we have on the K to 5? So the K to 5, there would be, unless there's a significant shift for the remote learners based on kids, like you just explained, wanting to come in, if everyone sort of stays, if hybrid all goes fully in person and remote people stay remote, there would be no reassignment of teachers.
That is correct.
Is what we heard at the elementary level.
Yeah.
So our teachers, I guess, and I shared this, actually, Dr. Kavanaugh, I emailed you the link to a decision matrix. I don't want to get into details, but if you could just maybe call up from the email I just sent you. I wanted to give as an assignment, like when we leave this room, to maybe think about each of these models along a few different lines, along typical learner lines, special education learners, remote learners, and our teachers. And I think this is a very personal thing, and that's why I kind of think of it as potential sort of homework, maybe to help as we're evaluating what we're hearing. But we haven't really talked about our special education learners in the K to 5, and I'm not knowledgeable enough to know what impact these changes would have on that population. So I don't know.
Can we add disadvantaged learners of other kinds in there as well?
So high needs
because I think,
learners.
like, children on free school
Yep.
lunches and.
Yep. So this is a sort of an eye chart, but I think just to kind of get you thinking, for the K to 5 model, the first 4 columns, there's sort of a typical learner. Instead of a special education learner, a high needs learner would encompass socioeconomic challenges, English as a second language, right? Special education, I think it's a better term. So disadvantaged learners, or just,
Well, I was trying to separate out children who might have some sort of, gosh, this is hard to navigate in terms of wording, but like inborn difficulty of some kind, such as, my kid with autism or my kid with ADHD versus a child who is disadvantaged by external circumstances. That's what I was trying to separate out those two groups, because I don't know how alike they are or how different they are, right? And so I feel like it might need a special consideration for the other group as well.
Yep.
Was that well worded? Because I feel like.
No, I understand what you're saying.
Okay.
What a child who has an identified disability versus, or specialized learning need, versus a child who has difficult circumstances because either, they're not getting enough food or something else is difficult in their lives, their needs might be different and might be differently impacted by a shift.
Yeah,
Is that?
that was my thought.
Yeah, so I
That's a
think
good
maybe
point.
there's another column there, and I think I like that. We could maybe add a different column. I like Nancy's words, so I'll have to circle back to the recording and see what they were.
I can't remember what I said 2 minutes ago.
You're very eloquent. But what I've been kind of doing on my own, I'm not sharing my thoughts because we all need to do this for ourselves, but I've been kind of looking at a bunch of different metrics like structured learning time and cost and transitions and access to curriculum, and we can talk at the end of the meeting about what that list is. And I've been sort of saying to myself, are we better off? Are we about the same, or are we worse off? For typical learners, for high needs learners, and for now we've broken this out, but for remote learners. And so as we're having these discussions and I'm kind of making notes, I guess I'm inviting you to think along these lines as well. And again, at the end, I think we can circle back to this conversation about what are the right metrics, but thinking in terms of, would this make us better off? Keep us about the same or make us worse off? Is that a way of thinking that makes sense?
Yes, thank you for discriminating in that way. I think it's really useful. And I agree that SPED wasn't a broad enough category to include the rest, but I worry about broadening too much the
I
category.
meant a separate category.
So SPED, socioeconomic,
Right.
And ESOL, I think they're all
Yeah.
three different.
English language learners. Okay.
Yes, typically, I think when DESE says high needs, they do mean kids who have special education needs, students who are English learners, and students who are socioeconomically disadvantaged.
Yes.
Okay.
I would also think, and I don't know that this needs to be in the chart per se, but when we're looking at special education students, I think the shift from one to another is dependent on, in any of these groups really, on the children who are attending 5 days already are going to be impacted differently by this switch than the kids who are attending a regular hybrid model on an IEP, receiving services. The switch for them is going to be different, and the pluses and minuses are different for each group.
That's right.
That's very true, because right now, if you had a classroom of, say, 12 students, and 9 students were general education students and 3 kids were on IEPs who come every day, they are constantly in a classroom with a very nice small size. And at the K to 5, that's how we have worked it out. So the kids who are coming every day are, really a nice small, the class sizes are beautiful. It's great for students on IEPs, ideal.
Right, and then they're switched back to a model that's more traditional with the numbers of kids, so that's different from the kid on an IEP that's going every other day and getting potentially services remotely or in a different way.
Like if that class size goes up to 22, attention must be given to everyone, so.
That's a good point. And I know we've all heard in email about families who have students on 504s who don't have access to the daily instruction, who are excited about the idea of getting more supports by coming every day. So it's a different aspect of a student who has other needs. So I just want to I forgot to say this in the beginning, I just want to sort of trigger your thinking, and let's circle back at the end to what the right metrics are. Or Joe?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about it, even the discussion just had there on 5-dayers, et cetera. Do we have all the information we need to make that assessment in the reopening report? Do we have detail on how each of those separate groups' schedule is affected, high needs versus moderate needs, et cetera? And I know if somebody's in 5 days, participating in both cohorts now, do we know in the report that all of them are going to have to leave the school at 11:30 or whatever the early time is for middle school and high school, or only some of them? I'm not sure I am able to make that assessment. For K-5, I'm less concerned because there I might just highlight questions to make sure we execute properly because it's being mandated. but on the other, I want to be able to assess.
Okay, so what I will say about K to 5 is, as Mrs. Carver said the other night, she's been able to invite some of her kids back. I think that at Elmwood and at Hopkins, and I'm not sure about Marathon, it may be true there as well, but they have done a really nice job to ensure that any student who was not really making effective progress in the remote learning model was was invited back. Oh, I'm gonna need a minute.
No, keep it on.
Speaking too much.
If anyone deserves laryngitis, I think it's
So we did have ESOL kids, we had special education kids, we had kids who were just struggling readers, and they were all invited to come into school. So I don't necessarily know that we would have to differentiate greatly, but just to be clear, Joe, only the high school is leaving halfway through the day.
Got it, okay,
Yep.
oh, that's true, right, thank you. Yeah.
And if you're an intensive needs student at the high school, the plan is to keep those students in school all day.
Right. I guess I love this approach, Amanda, thank you. And I guess if there are any boxes where I don't know for sure, I'll just frame it as a question instead of an evaluation.
Yeah,
That
so
should
that's
do it.
kind of what
Thanks.
I was doing, just as an exercise to see if this was something that is worth asking you to maybe think about. I didn't want to give you something that didn't make any sense. And that's where sort of the better, about the same, or worse, just sort of general is about the best we can get. In the cost row, I put the dollars. If, just because it's hard to do better, it's always worse if there are costs that you didn't incur before. But what I found was there were some places where I definitely had question marks. I thought it was no change, but I put some question marks. Me personally, I made the betters purple and the worse is red, and then I could quickly see, but whatever. So I think it's something we can come back to. Again, I don't want to share this, but I think when we leave here today, as we churn through all of this again, we can maybe synthesize our thinking, and when we come together to talk about voting, we'll have done some of this work, and it will kind of be a summary for ourselves. If we are able to move on past K to 5, do we have any other K to 5 information that we want to ask? We've asked about learning loss, which was great. If there's anything else we need, we should identify that. And then I'd like to move on to middle school and high school, because as you've all said, K to 5 is kind of being dictated. So unless there were a huge showstopper for us, it'd be hard for us to say no.
I don't know that this is not specific just to K to 5, but if we're considering sending a survey out tomorrow for K to 5, would it be helpful to also know for families who opt for a binding decision to return to full-time in-person, if their plan would be to take the bus, even if they're not on the bus currently, versus parent drop-off? Because I would think as we're tweaking the plan, and April 5th doesn't feel that far away, there are going to be significant traffic issues that we're going to want to address.
I would love to put in a question about transportation. And as you know, no matter when I have an audience, I say, please, get on the bus.
yes.
Right, but I think anecdotally, I know people who traditionally have ridden in the bus in past years, and some didn't take the bus because of the request. Initially, we were concerned about the buses, but there are some that don't feel safe putting more kids on the bus, and they'll continue to not take the bus. So I think we need a sense of how much mitigation we need.
Yes, to be really honest with you, transportation could be a huge disaster if we have, 600 kids, say, at the Hopkins School, and 600 parents decide that they're going to pick up. Like, that would be very, very challenging.
It's enough to keep you up at night, huh?
It surely is, yes.
I have one more question, and I don't think it's specific to K through 5. Is there, and I assume there is, but just as a question, is there a transition plan? So you were talking about the full-time learners moving into classrooms with, 20 kids instead of 5 kids. And once again, going through my experience with my children, any change in schedule and in consistency would cause huge amounts of emotional problems, right? And changing from 5 kids to 20-something kids seems like a very huge disruption. So are there transition plans that will ease that movement for those children so that they actually get the benefit? Because, with my kid, once a transition happened, it would be maybe months even of recovery from that. And so, if we only have a month and a half left and we're moving those kids to larger classrooms, I could see it actually not being beneficial in that case if the child has a need for consistency and such. So, I guess it's not at the policy level, but I'm just curious.
So one of the things that is true now in our elementary schools, if we're just focused on K to 5, what our elementary principals will tell you is that the discipline referrals have been close to like 0. And, we don't have loads of kids who are, kind of in those same kinds of needs that we've seen in past years. It is going to be different when you go from having, say, 12 kids to 22 kids, for example, in a grade 3 classroom. So the 12 kids would all know each other, and the other 12 kids would all know each other because they've been coming to school in that same classroom every day. And they'll obviously be very familiar with their teacher because that person has been their teacher since September. But you're right, Leah, I think that when there used to be 12 kids in this room, and I knew all other 11, and I know that teacher, suddenly now there are going to be 10 new people in here. And so I think, we do have the resources, certainly, in guidance and school adjustment counselors and all of the people who help kids along. But what that's really going to look like for individual children, we're not sure. We do have the resources, but we're not sure how kids will respond to additional people in their classroom.
It does actually raise the question, though, would there be any benefit in, I know we've asked for an adjustment counselor for, I think, Elmwood, for next year. And would there be any need for us to begin that as, even a stipended position or some kind of just for this year, bring someone in now to help, if we could find someone to start that, add that cost to the cost of reopening for those, especially the young learners who might need more help?
You're referring to the school adjustment
The
counselor
school adjustment
position?
counselor, yeah.
It might be worth looking into. I know that you can find positions like that even through temp agencies. They're typically very expensive. You're probably better off to, find a person
Hire them
full-time
early.
now for next year if you could. But I'm not sure, given the length of the hiring process, we'd have to probably start right away.
Yeah.
The other adjustment that makes me think of is these kids who have been going every other day. I remember my oldest children went to school back when we had half-day kindergarten, and the difference between kindergarten and then moving on to first day where they had a full day was huge. They were exhausted at the end of the day, and I would wonder if we're going to see some of that with our youngest learners. They're used to not having to be on 5 days a week. Just, I don't know how to mitigate that, but.
Right. They certainly could be, yes.
I think that's part of, at least what I've heard, some of the conversation around doing this now, so that when September comes, we're ready. Like we've retransitioned to this idea that we go to school 5 days a week. I mean, it's hard for those of us working remotely too. The idea of, wow, I'd have to go to the office every day. Like, it's different. All these transitions are different. And
It is, but I'm thinking in terms of they're having 2 transitions at once.
Yeah.
One is the everyday, and the other is that they went from 10 little bodies to 20.
yeah. I'm sort of going to make a little star mark to circle back on the adjustment counselor, at least keep that in mind, if there's any way that we can accelerate that position. Let's go to middle school. Middle school, Dr. Kavanaugh, correct me if I'm wrong, but middle school took an approach of cohorting when they were doing their design for hybrid, and so it sort of isolates groups of kids. There isn't the same kind of traffic of students throughout the school moving classes. Teachers are going into rooms. Teachers are rotating, right? So the middle school model is bringing the green and the orange in a cohort together and keeping that group kind of in their own bubble.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think one thing that parents should know about the difference between middle school and high school. So if I'm a 10th grader who takes honors English, for example, and there are 10 different sections of honors English at the high school, my guidance counselor working with me and creating my schedule can put me in any one of those 10 classes. But at the middle school, you're also limited because you have that teaming approach. So if Mrs. Jones is the English teacher on the Aqua team at the middle school, then if you're on the Aqua team, you can really only have Mrs. Jones. Do you know what I'm saying? So there's a real limitation in terms of, and then you've got the problem on a team of, you've got multiple levels of math, and you've got multiple choices in terms of world language. So, you know, as you start to form those groups, you're very limited. So take that team, you might have 75 kids who want to take French and 125 kids who want to take Spanish and 50 students who want to take Mandarin. So now you've also got to take those and try to find the appropriate settings for them.
So the plan for middle school is still to keep that concept of sort of these teams and kind of bubbles, cohorts together, which does reduce the contacts across. It's not the entire school population that's merging all the time, but they would be open full day.
They would.
For everybody, and they would go back to the schedule in the beginning of the year. Could you talk about that?
Yes, so when we say that, all we did was we adjusted time. So if you had a class that used to be 50 minutes, we may have turned it into 45 minutes and then eliminated Hiller block. So there would be that time in the day when the kids who are at home could have some contact with a teacher. So we didn't change any teachers, we didn't change any classrooms, but what we did was we readjusted the periods during which, the sizes of the periods during which kids would meet with particular teachers. So now, if we go back to where it was, we'll be sort of reinstating Hiller block and doing those kinds of things.
Okay. The kids will eat lunch at school 6 feet apart using the cafeteria, the gym, and the auditorium.
Correct.
And they'll have a regular bus at dismissal, which I would imagine would be not that crowded, even if every middle school, because the high school kids won't be on it anymore.
That's right. So, I mean, even if, you know, parents feel like they're very worried about the number of students on a bus, at the end of the school day, you've only got 3 grade levels that would be riding buses that typically 7 grade levels would be riding. So putting your middle school student on the bus after school seems to be a really wise move.
Okay. So what questions do we have about the middle school model? I know there's all sorts of conversation around how many kids would actually get new teachers. And there was, even though you explained it, maybe we could call that slide up, because I think there's still a lot of a question. Was it 73? Was it 10? Was it? So maybe we could go through that again.
I'm sorry, that's a little bit small. Maybe I can make it a little larger.
May I ask a question on the middle school? So one question I have, I guess, or concern is around on the class size, because while at Marathon, I think, you know, we had a range of 18 to 22 or something, and Elmwood was 19 to 24. Once we got to middle school is where the numbers started to be in the 30 range, right? And this might get to my 3 feet versus 4 feet question too, because if you have one or the other, you may be able to fit more or less in a class. But can you give some background on how we got to classes of 30 or 30 plus? Is it due to the fact that in hybrid,
Sure.
bring together 2 cohorts, or how
Yep,
does
I
that
can
get
go
to
to
that
that
point?
slide, and then we can come back if
And maybe
that's
if you
good.
could also explain any workarounds that have already been implemented to reduce the number of classes that are so affected.
Sure. So at the middle school, there is one grade 8 Spanish class where from 3 different cohorted groups, the kids come out and they go into Spanish. That class will currently be at 31 students.
So
And then there was a sort of a whole cohort, and their grade 8 science, social studies, English, and honors algebra will all be at 30 to 32 at any given time of the day. So it could be 30 if a couple of kids have been pulled out for some reason, but it can reach a high of 32. And, you know, that again comes from that cohorting model. So if we had, say, 16 kids and 14 kids who were coming, 16 in the green, 14 in the orange, it was working out beautifully in a hybrid model. So when we set it up, I mean, it seemed logical. And to be honest with you, when we were setting them up, we all knew that that there was a chance that we could go remote for the rest of the year, or that we could come back in person. And I will say that in September, when we were creating these cohorts, the thought in our heads of, were we really ever going to come back in person this year? I mean, at that time, you would never have thought that. Anyway, now if you had that 16 and 14, those students are coming back together in these grade 8 settings. There is, at the middle school, one of the classrooms is super, super big, and that's, you know, the kind of classroom that Mr. Keller will put them in. The 4 feet is absolutely achievable in that setting, but you are going to have 30 students in there with the, you know, the science teacher that they know, the social studies teacher that they know, the English teacher that they know. So it's not as if they're getting a new teacher, but they will have the peers that they don't usually see because they are either green or orange, and now those kids would be combined. Grade 7 pre-algebra will be at 30. And I think when we're talking about some of those high-end math classes at the middle school, those tend to get very, very large anyway because there's so many students who excel at mathematics. And then grade 7 geography would also be going to 30 students. So those are the classes that we are currently concerned about. I think on the previous slide, you might have seen that there were 8 classes that has been reduced to 7. So you've got the Spanish, the 4 grade 8s, and grade 7 pre-algebra, grade 7 geography. At the high school, I'll just run through those because they're up there. So we knew from Mr. Bishop that he said originally that there were 4. There are technically 5. One is a class of Mandarin, which is at 30. There's another class at 30, and that is an elective called Passages. And it's really a kind of an upper class, upper level, so that kids have this sense of what's it like when I transition from the safety of living in this, you know, community called Hopkinton to a great big university, and I'm living on my own. Then there are 2 that would always be above 30, so that's concert band and symphonic band. Those are no surprises. And period 6, grade 10 wellness. And very often PE wellness, those get a little bit large too. So the real concern, I would say, is Mandarin, and I'm not sure if Passages is always so popular that they get a lot of kids in there, but 30 is high there too.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So I know that sometimes, unfortunately, we're forced to put more than 30 kids in a classroom in the high school anyway.
Yes.
That's not ideal, but it's also not, this is not just a COVID issue. The middle school, I don't remember that happening before. Is that, what is the?
No, I do think that you're right, that at the middle school, you might see big numbers in the high-level math, but typically, Mr. Keller would keep those class sizes down. You know, I mean, you might hit a 23 or a 24.
Right.
I mean, we've seen some science go to 27, for example, but by and large, they hover around 20. So those 30s are big for that grade 8 group. Yep.
So are there some teams that are a lot smaller?
You will find that there are some teams that would be significantly smaller, yes.
So
And
is that
the
one
alternative-
team up there? That 8th grade, is that one whole team? Like, are those all the same kids in the science, social studies, and English? Because
Yes, those 4 classes all belong to one cohort of kids, yes, yep.
So I realize that all the middle school teachers and all of the administration are doing full-time jobs right now, but they're also having to think about scheduling anew. It seems to me that a Spanish class of 31 students, it's hard for me to see the point of that, because with language learning, you need a much smaller group. I mean, how possible is it to break these down? I just don't find it tenable to have such large classes.
Yeah, and I think the problem that you run into, so say there's one Spanish teacher on that team, if she's teaching those 31 at that time and then other groups, you could pull somebody out of that 8th grade science, social studies, English, honors, algebra, and move them into Spanish, but then they'd be missing their science, social studies, English, or honors, algebra. You know what I'm saying? Because those are meeting not when that Spanish teacher's. That cohort has a fixed schedule, is what I'm saying. So if you pull somebody out, then, you know.
They move
The end
multiple
result would be that they would probably need to get new teachers.
Yeah.
And I think
That's what I
if you
thought.
ask parents, would you prefer 30 kids or a new teacher? Or maybe if you ask kids, they would probably prefer being in a larger class than to get a new teacher.
So 30 kids from 15 is a giant adjustment for a child. In
It is.
terms of personal time, in terms of individual work, just in terms of interacting with the teacher and getting time, right? Is there any thought, if this were to happen, of having like an assistant in the classroom, getting someone else in there to help the kids? Because this adjustment, it just feels in some ways, yes, there's a positive of being in the classroom, but it's a negative adjustment in a lot of ways of having a lot less face time and a lot less personal time with the teacher.
Yeah, it would certainly be feasible to put a paraprofessional in that room, for sure.
Okay.
You know, still not an ideal situation, but we certainly could.
If you did have a paraprofessional, based on how the scheduling works, would they be assigned just to this cohort, so it would be another familiar face in every class, or would it be different by subject?
So that, I think, we would have to look at each individual paraprofessional schedules. You know, you wouldn't want to be pulling a paraprofessional out of a place where, you know, that person has been in the classroom for a really long time and knows the kids and knows,
Right.
you don't want to disrupt things for other students
Right.
to accommodate what we have here.
I guess my observation on this is that I don't know the number of classes on a middle school schedule or the number of students in middle school, but this looks like 7 classrooms, right? Very specific, and as percentage of all the class, it looks like they've done a great job minimizing this type of impact to result in this number of classes being affected. And I'm sure they're continuing to work on these ones to see if there's anything that can be done there. And getting back to the first principles that we started here today with, there's kind of a few criteria, right, that we're looking at here with the class size. We're trying to get back to every day, which was one of the first principles. Keeping the same teacher is something that people seem to value in terms of less disruption if you keep the same teacher. But then there's a trade-off here. The class size in a small percentage of the classes is higher than we'd like. So I think for me, it's important to keep it in the context of that first principle of this isn't ideal, but it's a trade-off because we have a first principle of getting people back every day and minimizing disruption by keeping same teacher.
Can I would actually disagree with my understanding of that first principle. I think what my understanding was that we had said in ideal circumstances, full in person. I wouldn't say that full in person at the expense of everything else. I would want to be able to weigh 30 kids in 4 classes of the 8th grade, actually 5, has got to be more than 10% of the 8th grade. It's not
Well,
a small.
the middle group of 4 classes is the same 30
Yeah,
students.
but so that's
Yep.
30 kids.
Yep.
Right? But plus 30 kids in the Spanish class could potentially be a different group. So that could be 60 kids. And those 30 kids that are bulleted together there, all of their classes are over 30. It's not just one. So I have concerns about the class size. And I know also I don't, full disclosure, I don't have an 8th grader. But I think to the parents that are parents of those 8th graders, I don't think they care they care about their child and how disruptive that would
Absolutely.
be.
Yeah, I remember, I'm the one who brought up the concern
Yeah,
about
no,
class
ab-
sizes.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't mean to like jump. I'm just kind of in my head thinking. I also think, though, from the previous slide, the kids that are moving teachers is problematic.
Oh.
And I can't say for sure which, I would have to agree with Dr. Kavanaugh. A lot of people would choose the larger class over moving classrooms. I don't know. But in this case, this particular plan has both kids moving classes and large class size. And that, to me, is something I think we want to try to address in a way that feels acceptable to optimal learning.
Before we pick up here, could you clarify, do you know if the Spanish 31 kids are the same cohort?
I do not know that, but what we do know about that Spanish class is that 3 different cohorts are coming together to form that. So there could be kids who are in that group of my singular cohort all day long would have 30 kids. Some of those students could be going into that Spanish class. I can double check on that for you.
Which makes sense, because there are only 3 teams at the middle school, right?
Right.
So you would expect some would have that, so maybe not quite 60 kids have that issue, but.
Okay, thank you. So then, back to Nancy's other point about the kids, yeah.
This one? Yes.
I mean, that is a stumbling block to me.
Well, so just to pull out the key points, so it looks like in grade 6, there are 10 kids who will get brand-new ELA teachers.
I do want to clarify that, because I don't think people quite understood what the situation was with that. If we think about grade 6, all grade 6 students, because we were really trying to bolster literacy when they got to the middle school, have a double block of ELA. So you've got a reading block and a writing block. There are 10 kids who, with their reading block and writing block, are going to get an entirely new set of teachers. So there are 10 of that 73. If you go to the 31, and you have a student who currently has the same teacher for 2 blocks, they will be keeping one of those teachers, but then getting a second one that would be new to them. So they could, for example, have the same reading teacher, but get a new writing teacher, or vice versa. And then the 32 students right now have a reading teacher and a different writing teacher. They don't have the same one for those 2 blocks. So 32 of them will lose one or the other, but keep one or the other. So that their double block will now either be the same teacher that they have now for reading and writing, or the same teacher they have now for writing and reading. I hope I'm explaining that well.
You are, but it seems like one of those very complicated word problems they have in math, and there's
I
going to be at the bottom that says, how many now?
Train leaves
How long
Baltimore,
will
right?
that take? Yeah. So 32 have 2 different today, and they'll keep one of them.
Yes,
That's probably least disruptive of the 3.
yes, and 31.
31
Go ahead, Joe.
will keep one of the 2 that they have today.
Yes, and get a fresh new one.
And
Okay.
10 are going to have either one for both that's totally new, or one for each that's totally new. They could have either one or
Correct.
2 new teachers, those
Yes.
10.
But either way, it will be new.
And math, like the grade 7, it seems like a switch to familiarity. It's between one person they had for a while and then one person, they've already had transition, they're transitioning back, is the grade 7.
Yes, that's right.
But in the grade 8 math, there are 23 kids who are going to get a brand new math teacher.
Yes, and I did speak to a mom whose child would have been impacted by that. And what the mom shared with me is that sort of historically, that group of kids have always had either Kristen Masha or Kathy A. for teacher. So the mom said to me she really didn't mind if her child left Kristen Masha to go to Kathy A, because Kathy A would be a very familiar face to that student, having had Kathy A 2 years prior. So I'm thinking that those 23 have great familiarity with either teacher, but there will be that switch there.
For those 29 students in grade 8, do we know if any of them are in the cohort with the 30 or more? It starts to feel like there may be a group of kids who are getting in a severe sort of disadvantaged position in terms of class size and maybe new teachers. So it would be really interesting to know that none of these kids are having to also deal with the switch in teachers.
That is correct. Those grade 8 honors algebra, that is not the grade 8 honors algebra course. That's a different course.
Okay, perfect.
Go ahead.
One last question I have, and this is with regards to remote students, and it's something that I have heard and I have internalized, and I am a little concerned about. We're expending a lot of money to bring students back into the classroom, right? And that's money that can be equitably spent across all of our student body. And we're spending it very specifically on, right now it's what, 3/4 of our student body minus any of them that decide to then go remote. So that's a lot of money being spent on one group of students, with the other group of students getting no clear benefit from at least what we've seen. So I was wondering if there's any plans to enrich, help, introduce new things to the remote students, considering the amount of money that we are, speaking of spending on one piece of our student body.
So I think there's a little bit of flawed thinking there, and
Okay.
here's why. If you were a remote student, one of the things that you've had is your own teacher having face-to-face contact with you every single day of the year. So if I'm a hybrid student, I have my teacher in person on Monday, but on Tuesday, I'm left all to my own devices to be able to get my work done. You know, my parents have to help me. But the remote kids have had, you know, they've been logged into Zoom and they've had their teachers every single day with them. And that is not true for the high school students. But if we take a look at the high school students, one of the things that we had said to high school students in the summer was that, you know, if you were taking multiple courses and they all had to be, and we didn't have enough to cohort. So say, for example, we were talking about grade 10 English and we had 25 kids, we said, no problem, we'll take a grade 10 English teacher and have that person teach one section of remote and 4 sections of in-person. But if you wanted something like AP Chemistry and there were only 9 students who were remote, it was going to be really difficult to give you a Hopkinton High School teacher, and you'd probably have to log in and take a VHS or a tech course. VHS and tech courses are like $400 a piece, so that would have been a great big expenditure on our remote students. And so what we did was, in order to make sure that our remote kids had Hopkinton High School teachers, is we paid $400 per student per course. So even though it's very different, we have expended an awful lot of money for our remote kids to be able to have a really high quality and what I would say robust access to some of those, you know, rarer courses that we couldn't quite cohort. I mean, to the tune of almost like, yeah, I think it was about $90,000 to do that in the first semester. So it is expensive, and, you know, we wanted to make sure that families got what they needed in this.
And just to add to that, live streaming as well, right? So we bought all the equipment and everything for live streaming for remote students as well, correct?
Yes, in excess of $50,000 in live streaming equipment.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify that.
So, can we talk about high school?
I
Or
had
there's-
another question
Yeah.
from the middle school, kind of, just what I have heard, and now I can't remember how many different people are, but I heard there may be an additional issue in the middle school with the way kids on IEPs are, I think we got a letter about this, actually, the number of kids on IEPs in one classroom when the cohorts are merged could cause it to be out of compliance with what the appropriate ratio would be. Is that accurate? And if so, is there a way we can do anything to help that?
So, we have looked K to 5, and we don't have any of those classrooms that would be out of compliance. At the middle school, you will find that there are classes that would be out of compliance. They would be greater than 50% students on IEPs. Unfortunately, the only way to remedy that, well, there are a couple of ways, right? So what we could say is, if you are a remote student and you want to come back, we can add that student to that classroom if it's a general education student. So if you were in a place where you had, I don't know, let's say 9 students on IEPs and 8 students who are general education, as remote students came back in, we could add that in there, but that creates a larger class size in a classroom where a lot of the students are on IEPs. The other thing that we could do is we could say, we're going to take the students who are on IEPs and move them out, but I really don't think it's in anyone's best interest to take kids away from teachers that they know and who know them as learners and move them at this point in time. We do typically have classrooms at the high school level where, you know, we're out of compliance, and we very often have that because we teach foundational courses where kids can, and we don't call them substantially separate. So it's probably not a new phenomenon, but it certainly is at the middle school level. It's going to exist, and I'm not going to lie about it, and this is the only way that we are kind of able to ensure that we have them all coming back.
Are they out of compliance currently in the 2 cohort, like, are the green and the orange both out of compliance, and so when they come together, it's just continued out of compliance? Or is one out of compliance and the other is not, and when they come together, it creates a larger out of compliance group?
I will have to check on that for you, and here's why I say that. if right now you had a classroom, say, that had 6 general education students and 4 kids on IEPs who come every day, and then you brought in, you might have some students who are on IEPs who don't come every single day. And that, I think, would be the only way for it to grow out of compliance. Do you know what I'm saying?
I think there's been a difficult balancing act from the beginning of the year in the middle school, especially with the 5-day-a-week kids
Yes.
who go on their cohort day, and then on their non-cohort day, they're grouped together in a separate room. So that's been there for the whole year. I'm not justifying it.
No, but I'm just
Yeah.
trying to tease out all the pieces we have in terms of the educational experience for all of our kids.
Yes.
And kind of how that's impacted.
I think it will be particularly difficult for those students to adjust to having a stream of new kids come into the classroom.
Yes. And we can take a look at how many students are in there. I mean, I think when we're talking about the sort of lack of balance in class sizes, and that happens here in the high school too. So one of the things that we try to do is to take those college prep classes and foundation classes and keep them very small so that students can get a whole lot more individualized attention. So the honors classes get a little bit bigger and the AP classes get a little bit bigger, but it's because they're more, I don't know, people who are able to learn more autonomously. So you can allow for those class sizes. So I can certainly take a look at class sizes across the board at the middle school if that is helpful to people and share that information. So what would those, if a classroom was out of compliance, what would that look like in terms of special education, general education, and total overall number, which I think is an important number.
That would be good.
Yes,
be
and the
helpful.
percentage of how far out of compliance are we talking?
Yes.
Slightly out of compliance, are we talking about way out of compliance?
Exactly.
And in terms of class size, are we looking at, the ones out of compliance, I would hope would be the classes on the smaller end.
Yes.
To make sure, and are there paras in those classrooms that would be able to increase the amount of face time, the amount of interaction that students are getting with an educator?
That would be helpful.
I agree.
Thank you. And the class sizes across the board, would that include like how many classes are like at around 20, how many are around 25, and then we already know how many are 30, but kind of in the ranges there?
Sure.
Okay, let's talk about high school. If you don't mind. So the high school model is different. As we all know, it would be, the high school currently has 5 periods in a day. So this would be 4 periods at school every day, dismissal at 11:45, and then students would log back in at 12:45. Is that true, or 1? What day is 12:45?
12:45.
For the 5th period class, which would be remote every day, and that would be, because of the rotating schedule, a different class. It's not always the same class. So every class would have a time when it's remote, but that would rotate. And regarding lunch, in terms of students who rely on school lunch, they could do a grab-and-go lunch to take with them as they leave to go home.
Absolutely.
And eat that at home if they want. So there's a whole lot here, I think, with the high school. The high school is a complex place. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, there were somewhere on the order of 1,000 and change students who are currently hybrid, and a couple hundred who are currently remote at the high school.
136 are fully remote and 1,064 are in person.
So we're talking about, a lot of kids, 1,000 kids coming back into this building. Just as a reminder, this building is under construction because we are adding an addition on the back. So where we normally would have 3 stairwells, we have 2. The third is available for emergencies, but for the flow of classes and kids moving from class to class, there'd be 2 stairwells, probably one direction.
That's what Mr. Bishop's plan is, yes, to
So-
make those stairwells one way.
One would be going only up and one going only down. And staggered dismissals from classes so that we try to minimize some of that hallway and stairwell congestion?
Yes, there are typically 5 minutes between each class at the high school, so he'll let out, say, grades 9 and 10, 2.5 minutes later, he'll let out 11 and 12. And hopefully that will get kids moving so that we don't have 1,064 kids all of a sudden unleashed, and trying to use 2 stairwells to get from, the second floor to the first floor to the ground floor.
So I have to admit, for me, the high school is absolutely the hardest sell. Like, K through 5 seems fine. The middle school has some pain points, but I think we've discussed them very well. But, like, I just think of parents' night when, like, not every parent is there, and you're still hitting each other in the hallways, trying to go up the stairs, or, like, crossing right in front of each other in order to try to get to a classroom because the flow of traffic is a certain way, right? And then I try to picture that with the 1,000 students back, and even if it's 500 of them at a time, that's about a parent's night right there. And it really concerns me. That hallway traffic really concerns me. The bathroom usage, and how many kids are going to use those restrooms all at a time, when they're not built for this amount of kids. Like, all of that just makes me concerned when I start thinking about the high school. I think they're doing a great job trying to come up with a way to make it work based on what we have, but there's just so many points, like you said, in the high school where kids might be within 3 feet for a period of time because it's hard to move out of the traffic flow. I hate to call it that, but you're moving in a certain direction. It's really difficult sometimes to shift where you're headed.
And even with a staggered dismissal, you have to get into the classroom. Like, there's going to be pooling until you can get into the classroom, because you can be dismissed, but you're waiting for maybe the people in the class you're going to get dismissed. I mean, there are a lot of bodies to move. It is tricky. I agree with you there. I just want to put a couple more pieces of information out first. So I think, I looked this up, and of course I don't have it in front of me, but the last day of school for seniors, so there are a couple of dates. Seniors, I think after April vacation, have access to, if I'm not mistaken, some career exposure opportunities that can take up to 50 or 60 seniors out of the building to look at careers. So around April 26th, I think, is when those seniors would have access, and I think it's about 60? Is that 50, 60 typically?
I would say in a typical year, I don't really know the number of students who have signed up to do that this year.
Okay.
Yeah.
We have to check on that, only because, I would wonder how many sort of relationships they're able to establish with, different businesses or those kinds of things.
Are these senior projects that you're talking about?
There's
Because the senior
career
pro-
exposure, right?
Okay.
Yes.
But senior projects takes kids out of the high school seniors out of classes. I know not all of them, but a few classes a day from around that time on.
Yes, and typically, so I think the culmination of all of that is the senior project.
Okay.
So it's a lovely event where you get to go
Yeah,
and kind of.
I've been,
yeah.
they invite us.
Yes.
So around April 26th, there'll be some unknown number of seniors who would probably be off campus. So that's one factor I wanted to share with you. For sophomores, juniors, and seniors who are taking advanced placement courses, there is a testing window that's determined by the College Board, and that is May. It's on our calendar right now for the May 3rd to the May 14th, but I don't know that that's the right set of dates. Well, we'll have to check with guidance, if we could, on when our actual dates are, because from what I read on the College Board website, districts can decide whether they give in-person tests, remote tests, or both. And the College Board has set up the dates when the different modes of testing can be administered, and the district can figure out which dates they're signing up for. So I don't know the details, but somewhere in the beginning of May is when the advanced placement tests take place. And last year, for anyone who had students, they were all remote. I mean, we were all remote in April and May last year by mandate, actually. So this year, there's a little bit different scenario yet again. It's a mix of paper and remote. And on those days, often, I think AP students are given a choice of, if they have to prepare for the next AP exam, if they have 4 or 5 of them, or 3 or 4 of them, I think they're often dismissed or excused from other classes if they have to study. So that can be a different type of experience in the school on AP testing days. The last day for seniors is May 26th.
I think so.
I think I have. And when are final exams? Because that's also, is that the last week right before the end of the year, like June 14th-ish?
Yeah, I'm not even sure. I will have to check to see if there are final exams.
Okay.
They didn't do exams from the last semester.
Yes, just so you know, there are 17 students signed up for internships.
Okay.
Oh, that was
Our
fast.
viewers are letting us know.
Oh, great. Excellent. Thank you, viewers. So those are just some more facts to keep in mind as we're talking about, right now, we don't have a recommended date for opening the high school, but at least we had a TBD on our slide. But as we think about, like, the seniors in particular, their window is a little different from the middle schoolers or the freshmen, or, the seniors have a different time window to absorb a disruption with testing and so forth. Joe?
Can you clarify that statement on the date? Did the reopening plan include a date for high school, or are you referring to a mandated date from the state for the high school, or
referring to
did
Dr.
our
Kavanaugh's
reopening report
slides.
mention a date?
Right, so the
Target.
reopening plan originally put March 29th in there for the entire district. And that was a recommendation from our legal counsel, who's been doing this kind of work with lots of districts. And what she said is, you should really put a very aggressive date in there, because you don't know now if you can do that or if you can't, if you'll get your furniture purchased and moved and all of that. But the most aggressive date allows you to have the most in-person time with your students. So that's why we went with that. At last Thursday's meeting, we had April 5th for middle school, still March 29th for K-5, and we had a TBD for the high school. And I know from hearing from high school parents that some will say, I really just want my child to get back there so that they have some kind of senior year experience. But the flip side is that if you have people go back after the seniors have internships or AP tests or those kinds of things, you're eliminating density in the schools. So that's something also for this group to be thinking about.
I'm guessing it would be too complicated to bring the seniors back, and then when they move off, to bring them back first, just because classes are mixed level.
We've had a lot of conversations about what if you bring back grades 9 and 10 and then 11 and 12, but the issue is that there are so many courses at the high school that have grade levels mixed. So you have some math classes where you may have sophomores and juniors, or you might have special education academic support where all 4 grades are represented in a small group. So it's just tricky to do that.
Even just grade 9? Grade 9 also has a lot of blend.
I think maybe only in, some of your higher end math, special education. I'm not sure what PE looks like for grade 9. I think they're probably all together there.
Can we get, perhaps for the next meeting, the number of 5-day-a-week kids for the high school?
At
But
the high
also,
school?
it would also be helpful for the other schools.
That
but
would be really helpful, yes.
So, one area that I don't think we've chatted about a lot is the teachers. And I'm just wondering, how much more work are we adding to their plates for, the different, like K through 5, it sounds like still the same curriculum, pretty much, still the same teachers, still the same sort of relationship with the kids. So it sounds like there will be change, but it sounds like in terms of how much work the teachers have to do to adapt to that change, it doesn't sound as large. If we're talking high school, what are we talking about in terms of the changes the teachers, like how much work do the teachers have to put in to make these changes? Just for a feel for, like, how much are we adding to people's plates fairly late in the year?
Can I tag on to that too, in terms of framing that in the context of next steps from here in terms of impact bargaining? Because I think people might not be aware that those kind of impacts will be part of a required impact bargaining negotiation. But
Absolutely.
I have the same question as Leah, but within that context.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we do, obviously, if there's a change in, maybe it's not obvious, but so I'll say it, if there's a change in working conditions or because of our change in policy, then we do sit down with the teachers union. We're required to sit down and impact bargain, where we discuss the impact of the policy changes and how to address that in a way that works for us all. So we do have a meeting on Tuesday, is our first impact bargaining meeting with the union to talk about, as these plans or proposals are taking shape, what would that mean, and what impacts do they see that they want to bargain?
So we hear from them the impacts that they see based on the plans that we're talking about.
Correct.
Okay, then I can leave off that question for now. It's just,
I would
oh, okay.
say that it's more than just the duty to impact bargain, but that we are, part of serving our students is that the ability to retain our teachers, because we're making a good working environment for them.
Yes.
Is vital, because what might serve our interests in the immediate sense, if we don't do it right, is not going to serve our long-term sense.
That's why I had the question, right? Because I mean, this school year has been very fraught.
Right.
For everybody.
Right.
And so it just seems like, okay, what are we talking about in terms of difficulty that we're adding to people's plates who are already really, really full? So, okay.
Yeah, if I can just comment on one aspect of that. So when we started this, we did say that on asynchronous days, we really wanted to have teachers develop something that would advance the learning. So currently, teachers will teach the same lesson 2 days in a row, one to the green cohort, one to the orange cohort, but it doesn't mean that they're not prepping a lesson for the students who are at home. And personally, I think it's very challenging to be able to convey that kind of information and have kids engage in something meaningful when you're not the communicator. So all of that communication has to happen in some kind of a platform that is, just technology, which really makes it, I don't know if you remember way back at the beginning of the school year, I think it was Dan Collins, who's an English teacher at the high school, had created a lesson on writing the introductory paragraph, and he had exemplars in that lesson, and he had, short videos to talk about, here's my thesis statement and all of that, color coding. So I felt like for a single lesson, that would have required an awful lot of work for him to get to the kids. So,
Yeah.
And can we be honest, back to the beginning of the year feels like 10 years ago.
it really does.
I do remember that, it was a long time ago,
Yes.
right? Yeah. Yeah, today we're asking teachers to do a whole lot of extra stuff that's very difficult when you have a classroom of kids, even if it's half of, it's just one cohort, but then you've got to now reach out to the other cohort who's home that day, right? So what we've been living under so far this year is great complexity, caused by the model.
And
And some of that will be simplified, but then we're going to be introducing more complexities too.
And
It'll be
it's
interesting to hear.
amazing how well it's been navigated, but,
Yeah.
once again, we're making very big decisions, and it's, I feel like, very important to get a feel for what impacts and what repercussions those decisions might have on everybody.
Yeah.
Well, and I would take that a step further to say we're making very big decisions that, based on the correspondence that we've been receiving, is almost bound, no matter what our decision is, to not make everybody happy.
Right.
And that's a tough place to be.
Yeah, it is.
Yes.
I will say that, again, just to share, trying to remember what to share with you from the school committee roundtable, one of the other chairs was saying was, they just keep realizing, because of all this planning that teachers have to do, because of sort of everything that goes into it, the model that we're in is just not sustainable. It's something that we have had to get through, but it's asked an awful lot of our teachers and our administrators, our paraprofessionals, our nurses. We're asking so much, and it's just not sustainable. So while any transition is, is tough, transitions are always hard, it's transitioning to something that is sustainable, that we can actually live with, hopefully. So this is sort of what they've been talking about, what some of the other chairs were saying. We need to get to a more sustainable model. I mean, everybody is just doing so many things for so many different populations, and the teachers are just going out of their way to do so much that what we're looking at, hopefully, again, if we agree to, to reopen, hopefully we're asking for something more sustainable than what we're doing right now. So.
I do have to say that when we're talking about high school, the next thing that comes into my mind is the testing. Like, once again, so many kids bumping into each other. At that point is when I start thinking about all the testing that we've been discussing, and, can we do that testing? And is it possible to focus it maybe on the schools that we feel might be at highest risk, and will that lower the cost, right? So if we were to do it at the high school primarily, what would that look like?
Sorry, you mean COVID testing? I'm still thinking like
I
EP
thought you
testing.
meant MCAS
I'm like
initially.
MCAS,
I meant
AP.
COVID.
Okay,
Yeah.
you mean like surveillance testing?
Yeah,
Okay.
surveillance tested, COVID testing, just, it feels like in the high school at least, they're at an age where the spread is more likely, right? So K through 5, we know the spread is lower. We know that in high school, it's more possible, right? And we are talking about a school that is not operating at.
Point of order. Our attorney recommended that we not discuss in public session items that we, in executive session, identified as likely to come up during bargaining. And I fear we're getting into that area now. We know that there are going to be topics that come up during impact bargaining. We, as a committee in executive session, discuss what those are. So I'm looking for guidance from the chair on how to proceed here.
While you're thinking about that,
Thank you.
can
Thank
I
you,
return to what you said
Yes,
before about the difficulty of sustaining this hybrid model, which is very tiresome? I was a member of the reopening planning committee along with Dr. Kavanaugh, and what struck me in our final meeting were the number of reservations expressed by administration and teachers, because it really is difficult to shift gears. And it's particularly difficult because we're all near breaking point. Teachers, students, parents, the emails bespeak that. And so my feeling from that was that one more ask was just one more ask too many. And I worry about the psychological health of the community right now. It's not just our own community. This is a national problem. Our predicament is not entirely unique. But the division is something that we will have to think about attending to and trying to repair. And to do as little damage. And that's where our job becomes most difficult, because according to our guidelines and our guiding principles, our focus is supposed to be on students. And yet the students are in classrooms with teachers. I feel like we're in a typical double bind, right?
We are.
No matter what we do, we're not going to come up with something that's going to be largely pleasing. And
the
the
polite way of
largeness
saying
of the decision is, I mean, that's a utilitarian response. Just because like 58 people are happy, well, those 42 who are unhappy, you have to think about their lives too. So I just really wanted to speak to the impossibility of this.
It is, and I don't know if any of us, when we ran for school committee originally, ever thought we would be in this position.
No.
And I think it keeps us up, all of us up at night. And yes, so regarding the testing, so we've been presented by our head nurse with different options for testing. And I think let's use the time here to focus on questions we have about the models and the impact on the kids, and how we process that information about testing we'll save for another conversation.
Yeah, I know you were talking about pool testing, but there was one other aspect of testing that I did want to bring up, is that our grade 10 and our grade 11 students at the high school also need to pass the MCAS test, the real MCAS test, for a competency determination for graduation. So that just adds into the and our AP students, we give about 1,100 tests. Now, some of those may be the same student taking multiple tests, but 1,100 AP tests will be administered.
Can I ask a question about the MCAS? I know that they have extended the time until which point they've given us an extension. I know that we have grades 10 and 11 that are supposed to be taking that competency determination. Is there any, and I'm asking off the cuff, but is there any way to postpone the 10th graders until they're in 11th grade to allow more time on learning in the classroom?
All right, so I'm glad we're actually talking about MCAS. On Friday, just before the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education hearing, the commissioner did say that he's leaving grades 3 to 5 intact for MCAS. But those tests have been shortened. So, you know, if before a kid would have taken 2 sessions in ELA and 2 sessions in math, it'll just be 1 and 1 to
Right.
kind of give you a baseline. He also said he was postponing middle school, 6 to 8. In the event that you wanted to get your middle school students back, you could be doing that and not have to worry about bringing them in and then, ta-da, there's an MCAS test in front of you. But what that really means, we don't know. What we do know is that the federal government, if the commissioner wants to say that there would not be MCAS in Massachusetts, he has to appeal to the federal government. And he has not done that, but I think also that he is not sure that the federal government would grant it. You know, and the intricacies of that, I don't really know. But what he is saying right now is that grades 10 and 11 do in fact have to take that test. So there's not really a reprieve for our 10th graders, I don't think.
And on
When is
time.
So when is it? Would you know when it's scheduled for?
Oh, I don't know off the top of my head.
This,
It might come to me
and
soon.
I know we as a district don't have any control over that, and what my personal wishes for what the commissioner would do are not really relevant, but there is a concern that our remote families are not going to be comfortable bringing, the reason they chose remote, they would not be comfortable bringing their children into the school buildings to take the tests. And I have heard chatter about people who may refuse the MCAS who have in-person kids as well. What does that do to us in terms of,
If you're an 11th grader and you don't take the MCAS now for competency determination, you can take it in November. There's a retake, and at least this is what our thinking is right now. But if you want a diploma in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, you are going to have to pay. I think that the science competency determination you can do through coursework, but right now, the ELA and the math, you still have to pass for your diploma.
so I'm thinking also just of all of our grades, not just the 11th grade, and the 10th graders would be a little bit less pressing because they do have more time next year, but all of our remote learners, the elementary
Right.
and middle school as well.
Well, the commissioner says he wants the remote kids to come in and take the test, but there's no mechanism to require them to do that.
And where would we even be able to put them all?
Right, so, I mean, right now, our kids could sit in their classroom and take an ELA hour test or a math test. But, I mean, the only way to get them in there to take that 1 hour test is to bring them in at sort of the crack of dawn and get them testing before it's time to put them into, before it's time to use those gymnasiums for lunch, you know?
So, let's see, before we get to student learning time, which I definitely want to look at the numbers here, the high school, it sounds like we have still concerns about density in common spaces and hallway. It sounds like across the board, the classrooms will accommodate 3 feet at least, to go back to our first principles of distance.
Absolutely.
So and where in the middle school, the kids do not move very much between classes. The traffic issue really is unique to the high school, the human trafficking, the human traffic issue. So we have students moving constantly between periods all over the building, across 3 floors with 2 stairwells. So this is a concern of ours right now. I did take to heart the emails that we got from the students who are anxious about their AP exams, and we have 1,100 exams administered. So it's not a small number of kids. For people who haven't been through this, starting soonish, really, teachers tend to go into review mode. I mean, a lot of the curriculum has been delivered by, April anyway, and then there's a review, and then the tests come up right early in May. And there are a lot of reasons why people take AP exams, but one of them is that if you get a 3 or better, there are colleges that will give you credit. If they don't give you credit, there are often times that you can advance in your starting level in a discipline, so that you're not going to waste your money on material that you already learned in your AP course. So whether it's, saving money by actually getting credits, or sort of wisely spending money on new material. I mean, AP courses are important to kids, and they're important to families. And so what some students who wrote to us said is that, they've adjusted to this hybrid model. If we bring them in sort of in the middle of April somewhere, and then 2 weeks later, they're going to be in the middle of trying to adjust, and then they're going to have to take their tests. And if they're families who are not comfortable with the conditions in the high school and they have to go to fully remote, where will that leave them for that period of time with a new teacher with 2 weeks to go?
Yeah, and they should not think they're getting a new teacher. I mean,
Okay.
they'd still be part of that class, but they'd be put into that live streaming situation.
Is that
if they
true?
went to remote.
Okay.
Yes.
Is that true of all the AP classes, that they would be live streamed?
Do we have enough, are all of the AP classes under that agreement to live stream?
I don't know about that.
I don't know of any that are not.
Okay.
Yeah. I
That
mean, we
makes
can
a
certainly
difference.
check on
Okay.
that, but I don't know of any that are not. Because I think the agreement was all of the AP test courses, and then we had some accelerated math and
Yep.
Mandarin, those kinds of things. But they would be removed too. I mean, that's the only way for them to learn. But the difference would be that they would be, the remote kids who are in AP classes will be logging in every day now, as opposed to every other day. So it will be an accelerated exposure to the curriculum.
Which would be helpful for review, I think. But it makes a difference to me if the kids who are currently hybrid, who are not comfortable and go remote, can live stream. Because the students who wrote to us were concerned that they'd be switched to a new teacher with like 2 or 3 weeks to go.
Yeah, and that's also interesting because there are, we wouldn't be breaking up that course. You
Okay.
know what I mean? Like, if you had, say you are Mike Franchuk and you teach AP Lang, and you've got 21 kids in your hybrid class right now, 11 are green and 10 are orange. If that student went remote, they'd still belong to Mike Franchuk.
Okay.
Yep.
That makes a big difference for me, because I think that was one of the fears that the kids had in hearing the stuff that came on the public forum.
If you didn't, we'd be dismantling schedules. And we're
Right.
not in the position to dismantle schedules, because
Okay.
that's still the meeting time of that class.
Okay. Are there any other showstopper pieces of information that we need at the high school?
I guess I'm just thinking that we continue to be operating within a very evolving situation too, in terms of vaccines, for example.
Yeah.
I know my parents just got their second dose. On the timeline that we're talking about opening, a greater and greater percentage of the most vulnerable population in Massachusetts will have received their vaccine. So if you think back a year ago, the big reason for shutting everything down was to stop the spread from getting to the vulnerable population. And with that vaccination rate increasing, and as the Board of Education reported Friday, the dramatic reduction in risk and spread even since January, I'm keeping in mind that macro environment that we're operating within too. I always come back to the HCAM interview when I was running for school committee, as others have too. And I said something about the school committee is a policy board. If we start getting into the operational details of what's happening in classrooms, we're overstepping. And here, we can't help but get into operational details in order to inform our policy. So it's never quite as easy as you wish it were. But I do appreciate all the efforts that's gone into getting to where we are. And I think the input we're getting today and that we got last week is going to make that operational planning even better and maybe reduce the impacts. So just wanted to share that. I'm not asking for more info, but just keep us aware of the macro environment we're in and all of that.
You know, actually, another thing that stuck out for me from the Board of Education hearing was, I think it was Dr. Medina. One of the doctors on the panel was talking about the increased incidence of adolescent and teen self-harm and mental health crises that are that they're just seeing over and over from kids who are in isolation. They're feeling removed from their support groups. They don't have the adults in their lives as teachers and so forth who can pick up on some of the warning signs that a crisis is imminent. And so, you know, we just have so many considerations, so many things to think about in terms of the health and well-being. There was I think one of the other doctors, that was a female, I forget her name now, was saying that when they're prescribing medicines, they like the side effects of whatever medicine not to be worse than the disease itself. And so when they're thinking about things like sort of all of these, the transitions and all of the different aspects of reopening that are challenging, the question is, you know, in the macro level, is the prescribed medicine of being hybrid doing more harm than you know, what would be the reality if we reopen?
Can I bring a counterpoint that was also at that meeting?
Please, yeah.
One of the people who actually voted for the amendment, but he made a comment that stuck with me, which is, if children's mental health is at issue, then that's a failing of the medical system, right? And I thought that was a really interesting thing, because once again, we put a lot of weight on our teachers who are trained to do particular types of jobs. Now, we do have our counselors and our, you know, support people who have that kind of training, but on a daily basis, we put a lot of weight on our teachers. And that is a very specialized sort of training to help kids with, you know, their mental health, their behavior, et cetera. I'm not saying that people aren't happy to support it. I'm not saying that schools don't contribute to it, but I'm saying when you have a pandemic, I do think it's a lot to be kind of putting the mental health of the children on the school, and not kind of also accepting the fact that our medical system probably needs a lot of work if there aren't other ways to help kids with their mental health during crisis times. So like I said, he voted for the amendment, but I really did think that that was a very interesting sort of point that he brought up.
Can I follow on to that, kind of on both of what you said, just kind of at a larger system-wide, not particular to Hopkinton or even to Massachusetts, but the number of crisis and emergency room visits for mental health and like self-harm, but suicidality and other acute issues in children since the beginning of the pandemic among the younger school age group went up 25%. Among older, it went up like a third, and which is really alarming. But it's not as simple as I think what people make it out to be. Number one, I agree with you that our teachers, that's not their, it's a failing of the medical community, not what our schools are doing in terms of their mental health. But you also have to take into account that this is a pandemic that's very stressful on families, and that those stresses are hurting kids. That the available services to help prevent kids from going into crisis have significantly shrunk. That in terms of at the higher level of like kids who are really acute, the number of hospital beds has been cut because of COVID. They shrank. Kids already end up in the emergency room for long periods waiting for beds. Number of residential placements, the same thing, and it goes on down to outpatient providers. But in addition to that, most outpatient providers are providing telehealth services, which for some kids are not holding them. And so that kids who are going into crisis might have gone into crisis whether they were in school regular or not, just because of they don't have enough services to hold them in a safe way in the community. Yeah. And the other piece of that is, in addition to their schooling not being the way they're used to, their social lives and their things that they're doing outside of school are not the same. Everything from sports is different to, in, I would like to say, most cases, kids are not going to large gatherings and things that they might normally be able to do, birthday parties and whatnot that are normal, and that impacts kids as well.
Right, in Pittsburgh, I mean, one thing I found out during a particularly hard period when my children were small was there really isn't support for when a kid is starting to go in a particular direction. There's support after they've done something or after something's happened to them, and there's support at, at the school level, obviously, all the IEPs and everything. But in terms of like somebody you can call to help you when a kid is starting to show signs or starting to have trouble or is starting like way before anything bad happens, there's so little of that, right? So yeah, so that was my point. Like, yes, the school contributes a ton, and when the kids are here, it's great how much support and help they get. But we also shouldn't put it all in the schools when it comes to that kind of thing. You're right, pandemics and
And there are no widespread studies that are able to scientifically say which of those factors is the
right.
biggest. I think intuitively people are saying kids are used to school, that's a holding place for them, and that makes a lot of sense. It also does cause stress for some kids, but there are so many pieces.
I just wanted to add this and kind of pull it back to Hopkinton. I feel like we've been very lucky that we've had the hybrid form. So many schools and towns have not. I think about Worcester. I think about those kids and the deprivation they've experienced. So I think it's been a great privilege for all of our students and for us to have our kids going every other day, and our special needs kids going 5 days a week. I mean, I think we're so lucky in comparison to the majority of people.
That's a good point. Dr. Kavanaugh, could you just share the student time and learning, and then I just want to circle back to metrics, and then I think we have a lot to individually process
Yes,
after
certainly.
this.
So you'll remember that back in August, we had a hybrid model where our kids had face-to-face contact with teachers only every other day. And so student learning time, the way it was measured is that they took the number of hours when students had direct contact with teachers, and they counted that up over a 10-day period. And what they did to get our average was to say, okay, what does that look like in grades 1, 4, 7, and 10? And if you took those numbers and you averaged them, you could see that Hopkinton was at 28 hours per student over a 10-day period. In this particular grid right here, you can see that it says November 2nd. That was when they asked us to fill in our times, and we got in trouble, so to speak, for only having 28. So then we changed things up, and on February 1st, you could see that we had new numbers in there, and our average over a 2-week period went up to 35. And there's been, an awful lot of discussion about whether or not it was helpful or not so helpful. So, but that's where we are on our average from grades 1, 4, 7, and 10. We're at 35 hours of face-to-face time with a teacher or an educator over a 10-day period. 35 hours, you should know, is the absolute minimum. DESE would not let you go anything lower than that. So right now, Hopkinton is only doing the minimum requirement of face-to-face time. And I know people are wondering what would it look like if everybody went back. And if we went back and we only had sort of a face-to-face instruction 5 hours a day, which would be a very low estimate. It's probably higher than that. But that would increase us from 35 to 50 hours a week over a 2-week period.
I think that's important to note.
Helpful.
Very helpful. Would you mind calling up the grid again? Go back to metrics. Oh, sorry, no, my spreadsheet.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yep.
So I wanted to just talk about like what important metrics. So I had put structured learning time because that is a thing that or student learning time, I suppose it should be. I have the wrong acronym,
No, I think structured learning time is correct.
okay.
I think you're right.
The cost to implement, we heard about furniture. The bus run, I think, is $76,000 for the high school. We didn't talk about that, so that's about $76,000. I had transitions to new teachers or classes, for a cohort. Like, how much impact is there across these grades? Access to curriculum. I think of maybe some of the students on 504s. Who could benefit. I think of, more days of synchronous learning or whatever. Class size in a safety capacity, where we've said that all our class sizes, regardless of size, would be spaced in a way that we deem as mitigating risk. So I think that that's fine, but I don't know. Class size in terms of a learning effectiveness, that's a different conversation. If we have 31 kids learning Spanish in a room, is that a concern? I don't know. I put a metric for disruption to high impact testing for juniors and seniors in particular, the AP testing we talked about. We've got some new information on that today. Safety in common spaces, bathrooms, hallways, lunch, et cetera, study halls. And then just other costs, other considerations like seniors or quarantining support or custodial support. Like, do we need stipended short-term nursing support? Do we need access to additional personnel? Is there another cost there that would help us be more successful? We haven't really talked about that yet. And so I don't know, what else you guys are thinking in terms of key things to be guiding our assessments.
When you say quarantining support, do you also mean support for the kids at home who are quarantining?
That's what I actually mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Do we need an instructor of some sort who can make sure that those quarantining kids, or do we need live streaming for those kids? Like, what is it that we need to support those quarantining kids if we have a lot of them? I don't know.
So we are required to have some kind of face-to-face contact for our kids who are quarantined. What that looks like, I'm not exactly sure. We have been, historically, what we've been doing, and I've looked at other people's models just kind of along the way, but sort of what people are doing is putting work out there and then just making sure that there's some opportunity for kids to be able to communicate with teachers in the event that they're struggling to get that particular work done. When they came out with the new guidance and you could test on day 5 and return on day 8, that was really helpful because it minimized the number of days that you would have missed your in-person learning. So, that's a little bit different from where we were at the start of the school year, but we will still have kids quarantining. And I don't know if it makes sense for me to show you any of the just information around some of that, the surveillance testing, or if you would prefer that we didn't even share information about it. But I think that even if you're doing some of that kind of surveillance testing, if you're doing it and, we have 10 swabs, even if you're using JCM, it would take, people will say, well, that would mean COVID positive kids didn't come into our schools, but in the 24 to 48 hours it takes for JCM to return your information, if I'm COVID positive and the rest of you are not, and we sit in a classroom together, 48 hours later, I've been in school for 2 days sitting next to all of you, so you're still going to need to quarantine with JCM. But if we're using something like Binax, where, my swab is in with all of your swabs, we still all are out of school until they determine that I am the COVID positive person. So just so you have a sense of what it actually means to, even with surveillance testing, that quarantining piece is still alive.
So can you think of other, sort of key metrics? And I do think, I do have a column for the impact on teachers. I think whether it's planning time or caseload, or, I'm not sure, but I think, they are part of this equation like everyone else. So
Just came to mind, Amanda, I don't know if it fits. It all seems so somber, right? I have a high school senior myself, and some sense of returning to some kind of end-of-year normalcy for seniors, I know is a priority for a lot of parents I've spoken with. Maybe it's up here in one of these categories already, but,
I have other considerations for seniors.
yeah,
I don't really know
yeah,
what it
thanks.
is,
And
know.
you did, yeah, I just wanted to share that.
I
Thank
do
you.
think seniors are a unique
Yeah.
cohort, and like even when you talk about what the colleges are doing now, a lot of colleges are treating the grades differently because the needs of seniors are different from the needs of freshmen or first years, I should say.
Well, just to share a little outside, but even the whole college exploration process is not as liberating and socially rewarding as it had been for seniors in past years. Kids aren't, in many cases, allowed to visit campuses, to talk to groups of students, to even meet with admissions counselors live. So, that's kind of the context for that bullet you have there for seniors is, I love the student council presentation where they're trying to do some stuff, a big event at least, but whatever we can do in the classroom to kind of close the year, given that they have limited time to kind of close the year together.
And they've lost a lot because they lost, a good important chunk of their junior year, which is a very important year for high school, and their entire senior year has been disrupted. It's been changed. I mean, they've had the hybrid, and I think you're right. We are very, very lucky that we've had clearly a very successful hybrid. We've received lots of email from people who found a real rhythm in the hybrid model, and it's working for them. And so I think we're lucky, but it has been different.
Right, and thank you for that perspective.
Oh, yeah,
Because
sure.
I had a senior last year, and, we saw the disruption at the end of the year, and it seemed awful. The kids were so, upset, and but I hadn't really had that point of view of, oh, wow, for these seniors,
Nothing.
it's
all-
been so
Yeah.
much more.
All the senior traditions that have been a normal rhythm for, many years now, they lost from the beginning of the year where they, all the kids go into the building in the high school at the same time on the first day. And I have a soft spot. I don't have a senior, but I do have a soft spot for all that has been lost for them.
So let me ask you, we only have 5 minutes left. I'm not going to ask, we're not taking any votes, and I don't want to know, we have a lot to think about, but we do have a tentative vote placeholder for Thursday. Do we think that we will be in a position to take some kind of a vote on any of this on Thursday?
When you say any of this, as we were going through, and it actually is interesting because we haven't had the opportunity to deliberate on this until now.
Until now.
But I do hear a variety of different opinions on each category that came up, and I think that's great because it's representative of the community that we serve. But would it perhaps be easier if we, rather than try to vote the whole thing, try to vote, when we do vote, to look at one,
K-5.
to look at one piece at a time, so that maybe we'll be ready to vote, say K-5, because it's a little bit different ahead of when we're ready to vote the middle school or the high school plans. I don't know how others feel, but-
I mean, yeah, K-5 is different in that we have a date from the state and a mandate, and, it's in some ways not as complex as, like, say, the high school. So I don't know if we are in a position to vote anything on Thursday.
Can I ask a question about the K through 5? If we did take a vote, are we actually voting on kids coming back? Because it feels like we've already been mandated, the kids have to come back. I mean, would the vote be like, are we willing to do a voucher? Is that the vote? Like, what is the vote for K through 5, considering the mandate from the state? Like, what are we voting on?
It sounds to me like we're voting the model that was presented. So we're agreeing to, say, physical education being outdoors.
Okay, so we're not voting whether or not to bring in K through 5. We're voting to accept the model for how the K through 5 is coming in.
Well, we could say, I mean, it is within our ability to say that we think that this would be a disaster and we want to apply for a waiver and we want to justify why. I'm not hearing that in this conversation, but I do think that there is that option. You know, I think there are districts in the state who are going to take that option, maybe. I don't know that Hopkinton is one of them, but I think, you know, in truth, we do have a choice.
Well, we also should have by Thursday, and some people maybe need more time to absorb than just because I think it's Wednesday, or middle of the week, that we're going to get the guidelines that go attached to their vote, and that might impact our thinking on our particular model. I mean, potentially, and I'm not suggesting that anyone thinks we should do this, but potentially I would assume that we could vote not to return and take a roll of the dice with what the state's going to do to us. I'm not suggesting that we do that, but in terms of the scope of our authority, is that?
Yes, I think we could take a hit to our Chapter 70 funding, which is one of the things that would be a potential consequence, right?
That's what they are alleging is one of the
Yeah.
consequences, yes, and I think that's, I mean, it might feel like not an awful lot of money, but you know that that's an awful lot of money.
It is, and it will add up. So I think that's an important piece when we're looking at how much it would cost to return to in-person. We also have to weigh it against how much it would cost to defy the state, in terms of how we would be penalized.
Yeah, Joe?
Yeah, to your question, Amanda, on when would we be ready? I feel I would be ready next Thursday. I don't see a lot of new information changing. I feel we have a bit of my perspective, I feel I have a responsibility to people who are evaluating their future commitment to public schools in Hopkinton, who are looking at private school options right now. And I look at the impact of whatever delay or decision we make on the attractiveness of Hopkinton Public Schools. I think people will be looking for, did Hopkinton lead? Were they in the leading cohort with the state? Or did they lag? And that will affect demand in our schools and property values and everything else. When you look at cost impacts, we might want to consider revenue impacts too of decisions that we make from the tax side. So those are my thoughts. I would be ready. I would have been ready a couple months ago. We have even more data now. And now with the trajectory of the spread going down and the vaccinations going up, I feel I'm more ready. And we had the benefit of this full reopening committee doing a lot of the research and now has a report that's been refined.
So I appreciate your perspective.
Yep.
I think that, for me personally, I think that residents value the depth of thought that we are giving to this. There are a lot of facets. There are a lot of residents who are strongly advocating for all different models. We've heard from, and teachers and administrators as well. So I think you have a perspective. I think the most important thing is that we do, as a committee, what is right for Hopkinton, whatever that looks like. So I think I really appreciate your time today. I appreciate your time to Dr. Kavanaugh and HCAM. I will send out the spreadsheet. You do not have to, like a
I'm
worksheet.
sorry, I have another Zoom meeting, so I have to
I know,
go,
I'm
but
sorry,
thank
Meg.
you.
So I'll send this out. You don't have to fill it in, but it's to guide your thinking, and if it helps, great. And the important thing is that we not think about the impact on just one cohort of kids, that we think about all the cohorts that we serve equally. And that is kind of, for me, what a grid like this reminds me. I don't lose sight of a population that I make sure that they're front and center. So I will modify this as we talked about and send it out just for your consideration. And go ahead. We'll leave the agenda item for Thursday. And I'm very excited if you send out the survey that we will have binding data back from families about what they'll choose, because that will help us.
Just K to 5 though, is that?
I would do it K to 12. I think it's really important to have all of that information.
My only concern is that people who are not watching us right now, I think people are aware that K to 5 has been mandated, that people who are not watching right now I would want to see that well prefaced by saying we have not taken a vote, there is no date for
Sure.
6 to 12 to return.
Yes, I am going to say it's binding, but I will also say that there's no date on which we're planning to make any kind of a transition. And I just feel like that middle school data is really important. I know Mr. Keller would like to see that, because if he has huge changes to make in scheduling, that's very, and it could even impact those numbers of 30. You know, say 3 of the kids who are currently hybrid decide to go remote, you know, now that's a class of 27. Not that 27 is great, but it's different from 30. So he's interested to see the data.
I would also be interested to see from Mr. Bishop what his recommended date would be. If, you know, I know that they're still evaluating a lot of information, and what comes out of the survey will help too. So if we get a sense of what Mr. Bishop, you know, on our Thursday public forum, we didn't have a clear sense of what he thinks or what you think.
On that topic, does it make sense to make it binding for the high school? Like, it feels like the other two are pretty solid, but it feels like the high school, there's still a lot of questions around testing and seniors, and so it feels a little premature to ask a binding question of parents. Maybe that's just me.
I feel like there's still a lot of questions at the middle school as well.
I don't know, I feel like if we don't have the
But
answer to
I
that
also-
stuff,
I
we
mean,
can't
I
move forward.
appreciate the operational piece
Yeah.
of it.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're de facto delaying if we do things this way. I mean,
We're
I
forcing
thi-
people to make a
I think that the
decision. though.
superintendent outlined the reasons why it's very important for her continued planning to gather that data.
Right, but by saying it's binding, you're also forcing them to take a decision without all the information
By
at
saying it's
hand.
not binding, you're saying we've made a decision to delay the opening of a school, which we
But-
haven't.
But we also haven't made a decision that we're going to open the middle or the high school by April 5th, so it could be that they have more opportunity to make that decision. We clearly have different opinions, and it's not clear where the entire committee is going to go until we're done with the conversation.
Yeah, I don't want to
So,
restrict the
Can I ask what
superintendents.
information you think is missing?
I just feel like it's not that it's missing information, I think it's teasing through some of the issues that we haven't had a conversation with our teachers, for one thing, and I feel like some of the concerns that we discussed about the middle school, I think, are significant concerns, and I feel like there is a risk in inflaming this before we've decided what the opening date will be. Is there, between waiting, if we send out a survey tomorrow versus sending it out for the middle and high school Friday after we have potentially taken a vote, is that operationally, and it's okay to say, yes, I'm going to mess everything up, and I will respect that, but operationally, would those days at the middle and high school make a huge difference?
I think the answer to that question is really in the magnitude of the numbers of people who want to make switches. Because if you have many people who want to go from hybrid to remote or remote to hybrid, we would need a significant amount of time to make all of those changes happen. You know, and I think the more lead time that Mr. Keller or Linda Henderson have to start thinking about those changes, the better served that they'll be. The other piece is that on that slide where you see that some kids are going to go from Jordan Church or from Lauren Bailey Jones, all of those individual schedules, the 73 kids, they would have to be changed as well. So we won't be making those changes until you have a formal vote, but if we have a sense of how many kids want to go from hybrid to remote and remote to hybrid, it gives us a good sense of how much time it will take to do A and B, the ones that you saw on the slide. I think that's the only reason why Mr. Keller was sort of pushing for can we please just have a binding vote so that he has a sense of the magnitude of the work. But, and I know what you're saying, that to send that survey out will make people very stressed. So. But I think also it may, I mean, if April 5th was the date that the committee had in mind, it may make it difficult to say, okay, between now and April 5th, we can get all of that done. Between the 11th of March and the 5th of April, we can get all of that done. So that's just something to think about. I mean, or maybe it won't. Maybe there'll be hardly anyone who wants to move from hybrid to remote or remote to hybrid. I do know that other districts had done surveys before they came up with plans. Like other people right now have those numbers without their school committees having voted on plans.
And for me, look, I don't know, we haven't voted that we approve the plans, but I don't know that there's going to be a significant shift in what the plan, a feasible plan is. I mean, I think you've looked at all feasible options. this is kind of it. Like, I don't know, I mean, like, you know,
just
like with the,
thinking-
with the high school, say, for example, I think we have the best feasible option on the table. Like, I'm not sure that I think I'm okay with asking about it because we don't have a lot of other options. I mean, the nuances there for me are, you know, what happens to those, say, the AP kids who are going to be uncomfortable or unable because of household conditions to come into that situation, so they want to go remote. If they are still connected with their class, that will influence decisions for those families, I think. But I don't know that the model will change. So I feel like if we ask for a binding decision in the event that school committee votes to move ahead with this, will you send your student or not?
So my feel, at least with the high school level, once again, I feel like there's a lot of questions about, once again, the hallways and things that have nothing to do with the model, but have a lot to do with parent comfort and understanding of whether they would be okay choosing to go hybrid to full-time. And so those little details are the things that I feel like parents will feel like they weren't put in front of me, and I was asked to make this major decision, and now the decision's made, and I don't know, you know, I'm projecting positivity and, you know, we figure it all out, but, you know, they may go, oh, I wasn't told this part, and now I'm in a binding decision, right? So that's my concern, because we've heard it from parents in other surveys before this past year, and so I'm just trying to get ahead of that concern that parents have been showing, which is we didn't have all the details about all the stuff surrounding the model that would have actually made a difference to whether or not we chose a binding. Sorry. go ahead.
The other piece of information that may be missing for some people to make a binding decision tomorrow versus after we have made our firm vote on when and what we're doing is it may make a difference to people if they're asking to make a binding decision to say the high school is going back on March 29th versus April 29th, because it's going to matter in terms of, and I know we may not all agree or disagree on that fact, but it does matter to some of the families, I think, how fully vaccinated our teachers will be able to have been by then.
And household members.
And household members.
That is a concern.
I think this spring, whenever we go back, there's going to be a challenge that most households will not be vaccinated.
But multi-generational households
Yes,
with grandparents, I
multi-generational,
think that's a
yes.
concern we've heard a lot too. I'm wondering, back to Leah, to your comment, like, so things like say the stairwells, nothing will change. Like, we have only 2 working stairwells. They're both going to be one directional. Is it that it wasn't included in the report, or people haven't had a chance to watch this meeting? Like, how do we get the information out?
Or what are the mitigation strategies? So, you know, you mentioned maybe staggering 2 grades so that the hallways aren't as full. Like, what are the mitigation strategies that we've fully settled on to make sure the hallways are working correctly and the kids aren't going to be packed together and they're going to be less than 3 feet? You know, like, those kinds of things I think matter to parents, at least from my point of view and like from the parents that I tend to represent. I think those are things that have a lot to do with whether you decide to put your child in a situation or not. So that's all. That's what I'm looking for. It's not the model itself so much as, you know, some details that have to do with, you know, do I consider my child to be at risk in this situation because of the hallway, even if the model itself seemed pretty safe? Or, you know, am I okay with the mitigation strategies that have been brought up for that?
Yeah, and if I can just say about the hallways, and I know that it will be, you know, certainly it's going to get a lot more crowded here than it had been if we're bringing 1,000 kids into the building. And we can find out the number of kids that we've already had here. But as I've been in, say, the middle school or the high school, and you watch kids go to lunch, you know, they will travel in a herd to lunch, and they'll travel in a herd out of lunch. And I think, you know, when we talk about mitigation strategies, I know that people will say, well, there's no plan to heighten mitigation strategies aside from letting students out of class, you know, at intervals of 2.5 minutes. But I think one of the things that we heard very loudly from the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education is that even with the situations now where we've had kids who are, close as they travel to PE or as they travel to lunch or whatever, we with good masking, and this is a huge issue, I think, for the high school, is just making sure that kids have their masks on and that they're wearing them appropriately. You reduce the risk, exponentially, really, if kids are wearing their masks appropriately. And I think that that's the best mitigation strategy we have, is for parents to continually remind their kids that you've got to wear that mask and wear it appropriately. Other than that, and, kind of like staggering dismissals and staggering arrival and those kinds of things, hand washing, kind of being certain that you don't have 15 kids in a restroom at once, those are the mitigation strategies that we have.
So I guess survey-wise, do we come to where are we? So we're going to send it out to everyone, but acknowledging that we have not taken a vote, and use the data to plan operationally what you'll do. I think if we don't take the survey soon, then we're going to be, the decision will be made for us. If we think it's the best thing to do to bring kids in, we won't have time.
I agree. I really feel like, I would prefer that we do the survey with the caveat that this is, yes, it is a binding survey, but no formal decision has been made. And I think we need to have that if operationally, we've got 4,000 students in the district, and so each one of them represents a schedule. So we really have to be very careful about the amount of lead time we're giving ourselves to make changes in the event that we do need to make changes.
All right. Weighty decisions and a lot to consider. I don't know what else we have to do today.
Lots of other things besides this meeting.
So we're a little over time. Thank you to HCAM. I think I'll take a motion to adjourn from someone, if anyone wants to make one.
Motion to adjourn?
Motion by Joe,
Second.
second by Leah. All in favor?
Yes.
Aye.
Aye.
So 4 of us in favor and 1 absent, and we meet again on March 11th, which is Thursday. I believe we have executive session, and then we have regular session. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much for pulling it all together.
And I will say to those who have sent in emails that haven't been responded to, we read them all. I just haven't had an opportunity to write you back yet, but we are reading them all as they come in. So you'll be getting a response shortly. Thank you.